A child was born on a battlefield, not during the war, but after. Long after the last TIE fighter had crashed. After the Death Star's remains had burned across Endor's sky like falling ash. But war doesn't end with explosions. It lingers in memory, in breath, in blood. This is the story of Poe Dameron, the pilot who burned too bright to rest, the last ember of the rebellion. He was born on Yavin 4, a moon once drenched in blaster fire and hope, a place where rebel soldiers had laughed, cried, and buried their dead beneath the roots of ancient temples. The Empire had been defeated, the second Death Star destroyed, Palpatine gone. But his parents didn't feel peace. Shara Bey and Kes Dameron didn't talk about the Empire like it was history. They talked about it like it was hiding behind the next sunrise. So they stayed, not in fear, but in readiness. While others celebrated in the core worlds, they built a quiet life among vines and stone, surrounded by the ghosts of their own victories. Poe was born into that silence, a silence shaped by two kinds of warriors. His mother was a pilot. Her hands had gripped the yoke of an A-wing tighter than she ever gripped her son's cradle. She had flown with Leia, with Han, with the last fire of the rebellion. But when she looked at Poe, her eyes softened, not because she had left war behind, but because she saw it coming again. His father was a soldier, grounded, steady, the kind of man who built walls not to keep others out, but to keep his memories in. He taught Poe how to plant things, how to build with wood, not with fire. But even then, Kes knew his son wasn't made to stay on the ground. The jungle around them grew thick, lush, and unforgiving. Poe played near vines that once tangled scout troopers. He ran through ruins that once held command centers and hidden blasters. Every rock he touched had a story. Every tree had seen things no child should ever have to know. But Poe listened. He learned without being taught. He watched the way his mother cleaned her flight helmet, even after she promised she'd never fly again. He heard the way his father's voice grew quieter when the sun set. He understood that silence wasn't absence, it was remembrance. Even his home was a relic. The house the Damerons lived in had once belonged to the rebellion, a prefab shelter dropped in haste during the early days of resistance, never meant to become a family home. The Durasteel walls still bore scorch marks. The floor still creaked with stories. Outside, a garden grew, not because they wanted beauty, but because they needed roots. Shara planted it herself, carving space for life where others had only carved trenches. Poe watched her work, quiet, focused, like she was still in the cockpit, navigating a battlefield no one else could see. He was never told bedtime stories about Jedi or Sith. His nights were filled with real names: Wedge, Akbar, Skywalker. Heroes who bled, friends who never came back, victories that didn't feel like winning. Poe's earliest memory wasn't of toys or laughter. It was the sound of an old Y-wing roaring overhead. His mother had gone up for one last flight. Just a short circle, she said. Just to feel the sky again. But the look in her eyes said more. And when she landed, she sat on the ramp for hours, helmet beside her, staring at the stars like they had asked her a question she didn't want to answer. Poe climbed up next to her. He didn't speak. He didn't need to, because that night something inside him shifted. He understood that his life wouldn't be lived on the ground, and that Yavin 4, with all its roots and ruins, was not his home. It was just the place where he was taught how to leave. Shara Bey was never meant to stay still. Even after the war ended, her body remembered motion, speed, altitude, the quiet fear that came before every launch. She tried to bury it, On Yavin 4, she folded her flight suit away, hung her helmet on a hook she promised never to touch again. She told herself the sky had taken enough from her. But war leaves marks that don't fade. Shara had flown through fire for the rebellion. She had outrun Imperial cannons. She had watched friends vanish in her peripheral vision, their ships breaking apart like sparks. Survival was never luck. It was instinct sharpened by loss. That instinct never left her. When Poe was born, she held him carefully, not because he was fragile, but because the galaxy was. She looked down at his small hands and wondered how long it would be before they reached for something dangerous. She didn't want him to be a pilot. She wanted him to be alive. But children watch more than they listen. Poe saw the way his mother looked at the stars, not with wonder, with calculation, as if measuring distance, as if memorizing escape routes. When ships passed overhead, her eyes followed them until they disappeared. Sometimes, late at night, she took out old data pads, flight logs, star charts, names of squadrons that no longer existed. She never spoke while reading them. She only breathed slower. Poe would sit nearby, pretending to sleep. He learned her habits before he learned her stories. Shara didn't teach Poe how to fly at first. She taught him balance, how to stand on uneven ground, how to keep his footing when the floor shifted beneath him, how to trust his body before trusting his thoughts. They walked the jungle paths together. She showed him how to listen for movement, how to know when something unseen was watching. She told him the jungle wasn't cruel, it was honest. So was the galaxy. When Poe asked her about the war, she didn't lie, but she didn't glorify it either. She told him about fear, about moments when her hands shook before gripping the controls, about the sound a cockpit makes when it's been hit and doesn't want to keep flying. She told him courage wasn't loud. It was quiet and heavy and lonely. As Poe grew older, Shara grew thinner. At first it was easy to ignore. Long missions had done worse to her body. Exhaustion was familiar. Pain was manageable. She had endured too much to fear weakness now. But this was different. Her energy faded. Her steps slowed. The jungle walks grew shorter. Poe noticed before anyone else did. Children always do. One evening, Poe found her sitting beside the old A-Wing. Her hand rested on its hull, fingers trembling. The ship hadn't flown in years, but it still felt warm to her. She smiled when she saw him. A soft smile, a tired one. That night, she told him stories she had never shared before. Not about battles, but about flying alone. About how quiet space could be. How peaceful it felt when the stars stopped moving and everything went still. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't need to. Shara Bay died quietly. Not in fire, not in the cockpit, but surrounded by the jungle she tried to call home. Poe didn't cry when it happened. He stood very still, too still. Kez held him, but the boy's eyes never left the sky. Something inside him locked into place. Something sharp, something unfinished. Shara left behind more than memories. She left behind a pull, a gravity that never loosened its grip. And from that moment on, every time Poe looked upward, it wasn't curiosity that moved him. It was longing, a need to follow what she could not finish, a need to fly, not to escape the past, but to stay close to her shadow. Poe Dameron didn't carry his war in words. He carried it in posture, in the way he walked the perimeter of their home each morning, even when there was no threat. In the way he paused before opening doors, as if expecting something on the other side. Poe watched it all. Kes didn't tell bedtime stories. He didn't speak of the battles on Endor, or the skirmishes where he lost friends whose names he never said aloud again. Instead, he taught through action, through small routines, through calm preparedness. There was never panic in his movements, only readiness. The boy followed him everywhere, into the forest, into the garden, into silence. And Kes let him, because some things couldn't be taught with lessons. One evening, Kes showed Poe how to hold a blaster, unload it, for now. He didn't explain its history, just the grip. The weight, the way it pointed. Poe's hands were too small. But Kes didn't stop him from trying. Then he set the weapon down, and they sat in silence again. Kes knew that one day someone would try to recruit Poe. For something. For someone. He hoped it wouldn't be the New Republic. Or worse, the wrong cause with the right words. He hoped Poe would know how to decide for himself. So he built the boy from the inside out. Every morning, Poe was expected to rise early, help with repairs, cut wood, haul gear. He learned the weight of real things, not simulations, not stories. He learned that even in peace, discipline mattered. One night, Poe had a nightmare, the kind children rarely describe. Kes found him sitting outside, staring at the jungle canopy. The boy didn't cry, just breathed, slowly, trying to push something away. Kes didn't ask questions. He only sat beside him. He understood that kind of fear, the kind that stayed quiet. The next day, Kes took him to the river. He taught him how to cross a current without being swept, not by fighting the water, but by moving with it. Sometimes survival, he said, isn't about strength. It's about timing. Poe never forgot that. As the seasons passed, the boy grew stronger, not just in muscle, but in patience, in silence, in stillness. He could sit for hours and listen, not because someone told him to, but because he knew that the world always spoke if you gave it time. Kes rarely smiled, but when he did, it was always when Poe noticed something others wouldn't. A shift in wind, a change in bird patterns, a new sound behind the trees. The boy was learning, but even in that quiet life, Kes sensed something stirring in Poe. A hunger not for combat, but for motion, for something beyond the trees, beyond the soil. A restlessness he had seen once before, in Shara. Kes never tried to stop it. He only tried to prepare him. One evening, Poe found a box buried beneath the floorboards. Inside, an old holo projector, a few medals, a single data chip. He activated it. The hologram was unstable, flickering, but it showed images of Shara's last missions, fighter squadrons, rebel emblems, her A-wing in flight. He watched them in silence. Kes didn't stop him. That night, Poe didn't ask questions, but his eyes were different, sharper, distant, deciding. Kes knew that look. He had seen it in mirrors, in comrades, in Shara before her final mission. The boy wasn't just his son anymore. He was becoming something else. A path had opened, not by choice, but by gravity. And Kes could only watch, knowing that all he had taught the boy would be tested far away from this jungle, far away from him. Poe Dameron was never meant to stay grounded. By the time he turned 10, the trees of Yavin 4 felt smaller. The sky above their canopy felt too quiet. And every day, the horizon seemed less like a boundary, more like a promise. He began with models. Old starfighters salvaged from supply crates left by the New Republic. Cracked, faded, half-burned. He rebuilt them carefully, shaping wings with patience, memorizing every panel, every engine curve. But he didn't play with them. He studied them. When he thought no one was watching, he would lie on the grass and stare upward for hours, eyes tracking satellites, transports, even birds. His mind flew long before his body did. Kes noticed. So one day, He took Poe to a clearing where Shara's A-Wing had been parked since before she died. Its hull was faded. Moss had claimed part of the landing struts, but it still stood like a monument. Poe ran his hand across the side. He didn't ask to open it. Kes did it for him. Inside, the cockpit smelled of old metal and memory. Poe climbed in slowly, not like a child playing, but like a pilot checking systems. He sat for a long time, hands resting on the controls, eyes closed. That night, he didn't speak a word. The next day, he asked about joining the Sky Patrol that flew recon missions around the moon. He was too young, too small, too eager. But he had his mother's fire and his father's discipline. Kes agreed to teach him everything, on one condition. Poe had to learn responsibility on the ground first. Repairs, navigation, comms, fuel checks. If he wanted to fly, he had to earn every meter. Poe agreed without hesitation. In months, he learned how to calibrate stabilizers, balance repulsor lift coils, and reroute power in emergency systems. He fixed parts that even veterans dismissed as junk. The patrol teams began to notice. And then one day, a pilot let him ride co-pilot. They didn't get far, just a low loop around the ruins. But Poe never came back the same. After that flight, he stopped asking. He started planning. Every task became practice. Every routine, preparation. He began building his own flight sim from scrap equipment, programming it late into the night using old rebellion files. He crashed, repeatedly, but he never stopped. One evening, Kes found him outside, staring at the stars again. "What are you thinking?" he asked. Poe didn't look away. "I think I'm meant to be up there." Kes nodded once. No resistance, just quiet understanding, because he had known this moment would come, because he had seen the same look in Shara years before, and because no amount of holding on would ever keep the boy from rising. So he gave him one final lesson. He took Poe into the jungle, deeper than they had gone before. They reached a cliffside overlooking the canopy, miles of green rolling beneath a purple sky. Kes handed Poe a pair of old flight gloves. "Shara's. These were hers," he said softly. "She wore them when she flew her last mission." Poe took them without speaking. He didn't cry. He only pulled them on, one finger at a time. Then they stood in silence, watching the last light of the day slip behind the clouds. The wind moved around them, gentle, constant, almost like breath. In that moment, Kes understood that his son was already gone, not in body, but in purpose. The jungle couldn't hold him. The ground couldn't keep him, because the sky had called, and Poe Dameron had already answered. She was known long before she was a mother. Before Poe Dameron ever looked up at the sky, Shara Bay already belonged to it. Her name moved quietly through rebel channels, spoken with respect, never with pride. She flew an A-Wing, fast, fragile, unforgiving, a starfighter that left no room for hesitation. Shara never hesitated. During the final years of the Galactic Civil War, she flew escort missions others feared. She slipped through Imperial formations, drew fire away from transports, and vanished before enemy pilots understood what had happened. She wasn't reckless. She was precise, and precision kept people alive. She didn't talk about her victories. She talked about the ones who didn't make it back. Even after Endor, even after the Emperor fell and the galaxy celebrated, Shara remained distant. The war was declared over, but she knew better. She had seen empires collapse before. She had watched chaos rush in to fill the space power left behind. Peace, she believed, was fragile. When the new republic began to stand, Shara stepped away from active service, not because she was tired, but because she was preparing for something else, a different kind of duty, one that didn't come with medals or briefing rooms. Motherhood did not soften her, it sharpened her. On Yavin 4, she tried to live quietly. She planted gardens, repaired old structures, smiled more than she ever had during the war. But every morning, she still woke before dawn, still checked the sky, still listened for engines that were no longer there. Poe would watch her from the doorway. He saw the way she stood when she thought she was alone, straight-backed, alert, as if the stars might call her back at any moment. And in some way, they already had. Shara didn't fill Poe's childhood with stories of heroes. She filled it with awareness. She taught him that flying wasn't freedom, it was responsibility. That speed didn't matter if you didn't know when to slow down, that the sky was beautiful, but it was never kind. Sometimes at night, she took out her old flight gear. She cleaned it carefully, not out of habit, out of respect. Poe would sit nearby, silent, watching her fingers move with calm familiarity. He didn't understand what the symbols meant, but he understood the care. This was something sacred. Shara never told him she was afraid, but fear lived in the pauses between her words, in the way she looked at him when he talked about flying, in the way she held him a second longer than necessary before letting go. She knew what pilots gave up. She knew what the sky took. And yet, she also knew she couldn't stop it, because Poe was already listening to the same call she once had. When she finally spoke about the rebellion, it wasn't with pride. It was with clarity. She told him the truth. That heroes were just people who didn't run fast enough. That survival wasn't guaranteed. That sometimes doing the right thing meant never coming home. Poe listened. He didn't flinch. That worried her more than fear ever could. As the years passed, Shara flew less, but she never stopped being a pilot. She watched flight paths, studied star maps, tracked rumors from the outer rim. She believed the galaxy was changing again. She believed darkness was patient. And she wanted her son ready, not to fight for glory, not to chase legends, but to endure, to make it back when others didn't, to carry forward what she might not be able to finish. Shara Bey had survived the Empire, but she knew survival was never the same as peace. And as she looked up at the stars with Poe beside her, she understood something she never said out loud. The sky did not belong to her anymore. It was already choosing him. Shara Bey didn't retire. She just changed uniforms. The moment she stepped away from official duty, she built a new kind of routine. One without orders, but not without purpose. She rose early, checked sensors around the homestead, cleaned parts that no longer powered anything. Her days were full, but always quiet. Poe watched it all. To others, it might have seemed like peace, but Shara moved like someone still listening for alarms. Her habits weren't routine. They were readiness. Even in peacetime, she lived like war was running late. She never admitted it out loud, but she didn't trust the quiet. Old gear stayed packed. Her helmet stayed near the front door. Flight logs remained updated, even when she had nowhere to send them. The jungle around their home became a training ground, not for combat, but for instinct. Poe was included in everything. He learned how to repair a transmitter, even if no signal came through. How to decode a scrambled message, even if there was nothing left to hear. She didn't tell him these lessons would save his life. She just showed him again and again. The war was over, but she was still on patrol. Sometimes a transport would pass overhead, a courier or a Republic vessel making rounds. She never waved. She only watched. Poe would glance at her, trying to read her face, but her eyes stayed sharp, measuring, remembering. She believed something was coming. Not the Empire, but something that would need her son to be more than safe, more than brave. Something that would need him to choose what was right, not what was easy. She couldn't stop it, but she could prepare him for it. Every walk they took was a lesson, not in survival, in awareness. She taught him how to read tracks, how to hear movement in stillness, how to feel when something wasn't right. A good pilot, she said, starts seeing things before they happen. Poe didn't understand at first, but the older he got, the more it made sense. Because Shara didn't teach with fear, she taught with foresight. She showed him how to fix their power cells when storms knocked out their systems, how to ration supplies without losing morale, how to lead without being loud. He followed her every step, not because he had to, but because something in her voice made him believe it mattered. In the evenings, she opened old recordings, not for nostalgia, for study, footage from space battles, old training drills, dogfight replays where ships spun in lethal spirals. Poe leaned in, eyes wide, but Shara never flinched. She paused the screen, pointed, explained, showed where mistakes led to fire, showed where hesitation ended lives. She made sure he understood one thing above all. Flying wasn't about skill. It was about judgment, and judgment came from loss. Poe began practicing with a training speeder. Low altitude, small engine, nothing too dangerous. But Shara still stood nearby every time, hands on her belt, eyes never blinking. She didn't smile when he did well. She only nodded, like checking a system that still worked. And Poe, in turn, never treated it like play, because he knew it wasn't. He wasn't learning how to fly. He was learning how not to die. Even Kez noticed the change. At night, he asked Shara if she was pushing too hard, if Poe should have more time to be a child. She didn't argue. She just looked at the sky and said one word: soon. Kez didn't ask again, because deep down, they both knew what kind of galaxy was out there, and they knew how it swallowed children who weren't ready to run. So Shara trained Poe with the quiet urgency of someone fighting time. She saw the storm before it came, and she made sure her son would not be standing still when it arrived. It started quietly, not with pain, not with collapse, just less. Shara Bay began waking later than usual. Her grip loosened while cleaning tools. Her hands, once steady enough to guide missiles through chaos, now trembled when turning a wrench. She said it was nothing, just tired, just age. But Poe noticed. She moved slower during their walks. Her voice grew softer. Sometimes she paused mid-sentence, like her mind had drifted far beyond the trees. When she held his shoulder, her touch lingered longer than before. He didn't understand why. Kez did. He had seen this before, not in her, but in soldiers who lasted longer than their bodies allowed. The ones who didn't go out in fire, but faded in silence. He didn't ask her what it was. He knew she wouldn't answer. Shara still smiled for Poe, but it took more effort. She stopped flying the speeder with him. She stopped reviewing flight logs at night. She said she wanted to rest more. But Poe could feel it. She wasn't resting. She was retreating. One morning, she didn't come out of the house. Poe found her sitting by the viewport, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the stars through a fogged window. She smiled when he entered, told him stories, asked about his flying, listened more than she spoke. That became their new routine. Each day, Poe returned from the jungle with something fixed, something discovered. He talked about engines and routes, about stars and possibilities. Shara would nod, eyes distant, always listening, always proud. But she rarely stood. Her body weakened fast. Some days she couldn't rise. Other days she tried, but the effort left her breathless. The jungle grew louder in her absence. The wind carried sounds she no longer responded to. Her helmet, once always ready, stayed untouched on the shelf. Still, she never spoke of fear. She never said she was dying. But Poe knew. He saw it in the way she looked at him, as if trying to memorize everything, as if every conversation was her last chance to shape the man he would become. She gave him advice without context, lessons without timing, like preparing him for a test he wouldn't know he was taking until years later. One evening, she called him to her side. Her voice was faint but calm. She placed a small data pad in his hands. Inside were her logs, every flight, every battle, every decision made above the clouds. No speeches, no summaries, just the facts, recorded with the clarity of someone who knew her time was limited. She looked into his eyes and said, "One thing, know when to return." Poe didn't understand then, but the words burned into him. The next morning, she asked to be taken to her ship. Kess carried her. Poe walked beside them. They placed her in the cockpit of the A-Wing, just like she remembered it. She ran her hand along the console, fingers trembling, lips parted like she might say something. But she didn't. She just breathed and looked out the canopy. The stars were faint in the daylight, but she saw them, and they saw her. That night, she didn't wake. The house fell quiet. The tools went untouched. The stars kept moving. Poe didn't cry. Not then. Instead, he returned to the garden, sat beside the ship, held her helmet, and looked at the sky as if daring it to take anything else. The galaxy would remember Shara Bay as a pilot, but Poe remembered her differently, as the woman who taught him how to fly and how to fall. The sky never gave her back. After that final night, Shara Bay became something more than memory. She became motion, the kind that never stops, the kind that lives in instinct. Poe didn't mark the day she left. He carried it forward like a shadow stitched to his breath. He took her flight gloves, not to wear, not yet. He placed them near the cockpit of the A-Wing, just as she had kept them, folded and waiting. Every morning, he looked at them. Every evening, he checked to make sure they hadn't moved. For weeks, the house felt colder. Kess spoke less. He wandered farther into the trees. His footsteps grew heavier, but his voice stayed calm. Poe never asked where he went. They both understood that some journeys had no destination. Poe kept flying the speeder, higher, sharper turns, closer to the treetops, as if chasing something he couldn't name. He didn't smile when he flew. He didn't speak when he landed. One afternoon, he climbed into the A-Wing's cockpit and just sat. The systems were dead, the controls loose, but he stayed there for hours, hands resting where hers once had. His fingers fit the grips now, and the silence didn't feel empty anymore. He began studying her logs, not just reading them, absorbing them, every maneuver, every decision, every mistake she had recorded without shame. Poe read between the lines. He began to see how she thought, how she calculated, how she survived when others didn't. He copied her flight paths using hand-drawn maps, recreated her routes on the speeder, practiced again and again until the motions felt natural. Poe didn't tell Kess what he was doing. He didn't need to. One night, Kess stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the boy fly loops above the canopy. No engine whine, no fanfare, just movement, precise and focused. When Poe landed, Kess said only one thing. She would have been proud. He just nodded, then looked at the stars. They seemed closer now, not like a dream, but a destination. He built a new transmitter using spare parts. It didn't broadcast far, but it was enough to listen. He caught fragments of Republic chatter, scout patrols, old encrypted signals. He began cataloging voices, names, ships. The galaxy, once distant, was becoming familiar. He stopped asking permission to listen, stopped needing reasons to prepare. By the time he turned 16, he was flying off-world with local scouts, not as a child tagging along, but as a pilot in his own right. Small missions, low risk. But every time he left atmosphere, something inside him settled, like gravity had finally let go. And each time he returned, he went straight to her ship. He sat beside it, spoke softly, as if she could still hear him. Years later, when he joined the New Republic as a pilot, he wore her gloves for the first time, not for protection, not for tradition, but because he finally understood what they meant. They weren't hers anymore. They were passed down, like a final order, sealed not in rank, but in love. Shara Bey never saw the First Order rise, never saw her son become the Resistance's sharpest blade. But her voice flew with him in every dive. Her warnings whispered through every near miss. And her absence was the one thing the enemy could never shoot down, because Poe Dameron wasn't flying to prove anything. He was flying to find her again, in every sunrise, in every battle, in every breath between stars. And though she never returned, she never truly left. The hangars were clean, too clean. Every corridor of the New Republic fleet gleamed with order, with symmetry, with systems designed for peace. Poe Dameron walked them in silence, his boots clicking softly against polished floors. His uniform was crisp, his rank earned. But something inside him never settled. He had expected it to feel like home. It didn't. The war was over, but its memory still lived in his bones. He had grown up surrounded by survivors, not strategists. His mother had flown through chaos, not checklists. His father had fought without asking why. Now Poe stood among pilots who'd never seen combat, who flew drills, not missions. They smiled often, but their eyes were quiet. He joined because he believed the galaxy still needed protection. That peace wasn't something you defended once. It was something you watched, always. But the New Republic wasn't watching. It was reorganizing. Poe was given a seat in Rapier Squadron. He flew his X-Wing like it was part of him. Every roll, precise. Every adjustment, instinctual. His wingmates called him fast. His instructors called him bold. But command called him difficult. Because Poe asked questions. Not about politics. About silence. Why were patrols scaled back near unstable systems? Why were warnings from frontier worlds filed away without action? Why were the scars of the Empire still visible, but untouched? The answers came slow and cold. We're not at war anymore. We must respect sovereignty. Local disputes are not our concern. Poe didn't argue, but his silence grew heavier. On one patrol, he flew past the debris field of an old Imperial outpost. The sensors read neutral, but Poe scanned twice. He picked up faint emissions, shield flickers, power surges, signs of activity. When he reported it, the command flagged it for review. But no one moved. A month later, a freighter vanished near the same sector. That became a pattern. Signals missed, calls unanswered. And every time Poe tried to push harder, he met the same resistance. Senators, not soldiers, shaped the galaxy now. Poe learned to work around it. He kept detailed logs, recorded anomalies, built his own reports from fragments that others overlooked. His fellow pilots respected him, but kept their distance. He wasn't reckless, but he was restless. Every flight felt like waiting, not for orders, for something to break. And then one day it did. A patrol near the Minfar system detected a refugee convoy under attack. Pirates or remnants of an Imperial cell, it wasn't clear. Command ordered a hold. They needed authorization. They needed a Senate response. Poe didn't wait. He led 3 pilots into the fray. They arrived in time, disabled the lead attacker, escorted the convoy to safety. No losses, no damage. Lives were saved, and Poe returned, expecting silence. But this time, there were voices. His flight report was flagged. His command officer reprimanded him behind closed doors. He hadn't followed protocol. He hadn't respected the chain of command. You acted without approval, they said. You forced the Senate's hand, they added. Poe said nothing. Because he already knew. The uniform wasn't made for the kind of war he'd been raised in. It was made for a peace that needed permission to act. He began flying differently after that. Not sloppier, not faster, just quieter. He spoke less in briefings, offered fewer opinions, but he watched more, listened more, filed reports others ignored. He wasn't waiting for orders. He was waiting for proof that the war wasn't over, that it had only changed uniforms. The signal came at midnight, encrypted, fragmented, faint. A distress call from the Lorad sector, a place the Senate had labeled low priority. Pirate activity had been rising in the Outer Rim, but few in the core took it seriously. It was too far, too scattered, too inconvenient. But Poe read the signal twice, and then a third time. Civilian transport. No weapons. Engines damaged. Being hunted. Protocol demanded escalation. Submit the report. Wait for chain of command review. Monitor the situation, but do not engage. Poe opened the flight deck log, started the report, typed the first line, then stopped. He knew what would happen. A delay, a debate, a loss. So instead of waiting, he walked to his X-Wing. He didn't make a speech, didn't rally support. He pinged 2 squad mates who trusted his instincts, told them enough to get in the air. Not enough for them to hesitate. They launched under cover of night. No fanfare, no clearance, just the hum of engines and 3 ships disappearing into the dark. The coordinates were rough, but Poe followed the heat trails. He found the convoy above a gas giant, drifting near the upper atmosphere, its shields flickering like dying stars. Around it, 6 starfighters, running slow attack patterns, herding the transport like prey. Poe didn't hesitate. He didn't need to. His squad moved on instinct. Poe led the first dive, splitting their formation with blaster fire. He drew the attackers away, forced them to scatter. His wingmate disabled one with a clean ion burst. Another clipped a wing, sending debris spiraling into the clouds below. The fight didn't last long, but it didn't end cleanly. 2 pirates fled into the storm. The rest fell silent. The convoy, damaged but intact, sent a flicker of thanks through the comms. Their voices were weak. Poe didn't ask questions. He just flew alongside them until they were safe. When he returned to base, there was no ceremony, only waiting. Command summoned him within the hour. He was calm, direct, respectful. They weren't angry. They were disappointed. He had violated operational boundaries, risked escalation, ignored oversight. They reminded him that the new republic had chosen diplomacy over reaction, that every action he took without permission risked weakening that position. Poe listened, then said one thing. They would have died. The room went quiet. The officer across from him didn't disagree, but his silence said more than words. They didn't demote him. They didn't promote him either. He was placed on administrative review, assigned to ground duty, flight privileges suspended pending evaluation of decision-making alignment with New Republic standards. In the Senate, his name came up in whispers. A pilot with history, with legacy, with a tendency to act. Some called it dangerous. Others called it familiar. He wasn't court-martialed. He was observed, and Poe understood. He had saved lives, but he had broken trust, not with his squad, but with the system. One built for caution, for votes, for rules shaped by peacetime minds. He returned to his quarters, sat alone, wrote his own report, the full version, his version, every maneuver, every voice heard, every silence ignored. He didn't submit it. He just kept it. Because he needed to remember the moment, the one when he stopped asking for permission to do what was right. He hadn't betrayed his command. He had fulfilled his purpose. And somewhere he believed someone would see that. Eventually. They didn't ground him to punish him. They grounded him to quiet him. After Lorad, Poe was reassigned. Not with anger, not with dishonor, just silence. A transfer slip. New orders. A post far from major routes. A ship too old for war, too visible to forget. Diplomatic escort duty. He was given a T-85 X-Wing. Newer frame. Slower soul. The missions were uneventful. Senatorial flybys. Border patrols near systems that didn't need protecting. The Republic wanted presence, not engagement. Poe flew every assignment, on time, by the book. He smiled at dignitaries, followed formations, logged standard reports, but his eyes never stopped searching. He scanned comms channels even when ordered not to, tracked freighter routes, marked inconsistencies in local star traffic. He wasn't hunting trouble. He just couldn't stop seeing it. The galaxy wasn't stable. It was quiet. And quiet, Poe had learned, could mean ambush. Command called him thorough. But privately, they called him something else. Unsettled. He asked questions during briefings, pushed for clarification in fleet status updates. Why was Corellian security weakened? Why were old Imperial holdings being sold to anonymous buyers? Why was no one watching the unknown regions? Answers never came. Instead, more reassignments. Next was cargo patrol, then escort duty for supply convoys between Chandrila and Talasea. He logged more light years than action. The only stars he saw were behind him. But Poe never stopped recording what he noticed. He submitted detailed logs, cross-checked sensor data, flagged transponder irregularities. Every entry was professional. Every entry was ignored. He was becoming a box to be checked, a symbol in a system that didn't want questions. Some in command viewed him as loyal, if intense. Others thought he was chasing ghosts. His performance was flawless, but his instincts didn't fit into flowcharts. One officer noted it plainly. Pilot Dameron's behavior aligns more with field command than political order. And that was the problem. The New Republic had field commanders, but it didn't want them leading. It wanted stability, not initiative. Poe wasn't frustrated. He was patient. He didn't fight back, didn't lash out. He flew his missions, monitored transmissions, learned how to listen between the frequencies. He was learning something his instructors hadn't taught: how to wait without falling asleep, how to obey without falling silent. He flew near the expansion region when he picked up a coded message. It was scrambled, ancient encryption, Republic error, buried under layers of static. He flagged it, sent it to command. They marked it non-urgent. Poe tracked it himself. He triangulated the signal to a derelict satellite near the edges of wild space. He logged it, recorded the audio, heard breathing, heard fear. The voice was faint, but it repeated one word: help. He wasn't allowed to respond. So he didn't, but he saved the message, because somewhere out there, someone still needed the kind of pilot the Republic no longer made room for. And Poe knew he was being watched. His logs were reviewed, his conversations noted, his performance remained perfect, but his reputation was growing uncomfortable. Not because of failure, but because he reminded them of someone else. Someone who once flew without waiting, someone who once stood when told to sit, someone who saved the galaxy by disobeying it. The name was spoken only once, in a closed briefing. Organa. Poe never heard it, but the echo was already moving toward him. Leia Organa had learned to recognize patterns, not in data, in people. She didn't need sensors to spot unrest. She didn't need files to spot fire. She had spent her life watching brave soldiers become dangerous ones, not because they were wrong, but because the systems around them had grown tired of being reminded what war cost. Poe Dameron's name reached her quietly. It came buried in personnel files, flagged with soft concern, reassignment frequency, notes on behavior, commendations lined next to cautions. Not insubordination, but friction. He wasn't failing. He was simply not adapting. Leia read the file 3 times. Then she read between the lines. She saw his mother's name first. Shara Bay, an ace who had flown beside her. Brave, quiet, gone too soon. Then she saw the father. Kes Dameron. Ground team on Endor. Loyal, steady. Survivors of a war that had never left them. The son was a mixture of both. But the file didn't say that. The file called him misaligned. Leia didn't laugh. She just stared at the word. She remembered what the New Republic used to be and what it had become. A body with too many voices. A heart with no rhythm. A peace bought with the assumption that vigilance was paranoia. But she knew better. She had been watching the First Order rise in the dark. Watching fleets grow in silence. Watching loyal soldiers be ignored because the galaxy didn't want to be warned. She didn't need another politician. She needed a pilot, one who didn't need orders to act. She began making inquiries. Discreet, personal, not through command, through trust. She spoke to a former officer Poe had flown with. The woman didn't offer a summary. She offered a sentence. If something broke, he was already moving before anyone else noticed. Leia didn't ask anything else. She requested Poe's transfer, not to a command center, not to a strategy desk, to her. The resistance was still in its early phase, unrecognized, unofficial, and unwelcome. But it was real, and it needed someone who could fly without hesitation, someone who could chase shadows without waiting for permission. Poe was summoned to meet her. He didn't know why. He walked into the room expecting evaluation, lecture, reprimand. He found silence. Leia stood at the edge of the map table. A cluster of stars rotated slowly between them. No Senate, no titles. Just her eyes, sharp and steady. "You're not a problem," she said. "You're a warning. They think peace means we don't need people like you. But peace doesn't last unless someone's willing to protect it before it breaks." She didn't ask if he believed her. She asked if he was ready. And Poe, for the first time in years, didn't hesitate. He wasn't joining a movement. He was returning to something that had been waiting for him since the day his mother left her helmet near the door. Leia gave him one order. Fly fast. Trust yourself. And never wait for the wrong people to give you permission to do the right thing. Poe nodded. Not like a soldier. Like a pilot who finally had somewhere to go. He left that meeting with no rank, no assignment, no medals. Only a name. and a place in something that hadn't yet been recognized, but was already preparing for war. The Republic turned inward. While senators debated trade routes and reforms, Leia Organa looked beyond the stars and saw something moving. It had no name yet, no capital, no army with banners. But she felt its shape forming in the silence. She called it what it was, the First Order. No one listened, so she stopped trying to convince them and started building something smaller, something quieter, something that could move before it was too late. She called it the Resistance. It wasn't recognized, it wasn't funded, it wasn't welcome, but it was real. And she needed people who didn't wait to be told the fight had already started. Poe Dameron had flown under a dozen commanders. None of them had looked at him the way Leia did. She didn't see defiance. She saw memory. She saw the same fire she once carried into Imperial halls, the same weight she once wore while leading doomed missions across the mid-rim. She saw a pilot who had been raised by war, who had learned patience the hard way, and who had never been given permission to believe in peace. She didn't ask him to lead, she asked him to act. The resistance wasn't about command, it was about motion. Every member mattered. Every cell was exposed. Every decision could be the last one they made. Leia gave Poe a ship, a mission, and a warning. No one's watching us, but everyone's counting on us. Poe understood. His first assignments weren't glamorous. Recon runs, surveillance checks near abandoned Imperial outposts, escorting diplomats who weren't really diplomats. The resistance moved like a rumor, threading itself through the cracks of the New Republic's blind spots. Poe didn't need applause. He needed altitude, and Leia gave it to him. He began to build patterns, places where old Imperial loyalists had gathered, fringe sectors where ships disappeared without report, refugees who spoke of uniforms without insignia, whispers of Starkiller, whispers of a weapon that didn't yet exist, but would. He brought every detail to Leia. She never doubted him, even when others did. In the Resistance, there was no time for slow trust. Either you believed, or you left. And Poe believed in one thing, that the next war had already begun. It just hadn't been announced. His flights grew longer, his silence deeper. He began sleeping in his cockpit, studying star maps between systems, refueling at outposts that weren't supposed to exist. He learned to land without being seen, to speak in codes no one taught him. Leia gave him space. She knew what it meant to carry too much, too soon. But she also knew Poe wasn't breaking. He was transforming, not into a hero, not into a leader, into a spark. And that spark would soon become something more. The Resistance had no anthem, no fleet to rally around. But it had Poe and others like him, scattered, focused, unshaken. He didn't wear medals. He wore trust. And in the dark spaces between stars, that was enough. Because every time he launched, he carried the same thought. Not will I return, but will they be ready? He was flying to buy time. Time for the galaxy to open its eyes. And time, Poe knew, was already running out. The Resistance had no borders. It lived in fragments, codes passed in marketplaces, safe houses buried in wreckage, refueling stations built from salvaged parts of old wars. Poe Dameron flew through them all, his path unmarked on any official chart. But he kept his own map. It wasn't digital. It was memory. Each point marked by silence, a ship that vanished, a colony that stopped sending signals, a station reporting fuel shortages, then nothing at all. Poe flew to places others forgot. He traced ghost signals near the anode sector, found orbital debris where a supply post should have been. He scanned the remains, blackened metal scorched with plasma, but no bodies, No names, just absence. He flagged it, logged it, moved on. He didn't ask for backup. He knew there wasn't any. Sometimes he landed, spoke with locals too afraid to give their names, heard the same story again and again, uniforms with no emblems, commands spoken in perfect basic, ships that looked imperial, but cleaner, quieter, hungrier. The First Order didn't announce itself. It erased, and Poe understood that faster than most. He tracked supply routes along the edge of wild space, mapped migration patterns of survivors fleeing something they couldn't describe. Every course he plotted told a story of preparation, of positioning, of an enemy hiding in plain sight. He brought the reports back to Leia. She read them in silence, then handed them back. "Keep going," she said. So he did. Some nights he flew alone. No orders, no escort. Just coordinates he couldn't ignore. He found ruins that weren't in any archive. Craters from orbital strikes never claimed. Empty towns with meals still on the tables. Someone had come. Someone had left. And no one wanted to talk about who. The New Republic labeled these events as piracy. Poe labeled them as warning signs. He wasn't chasing shadows. He was following a pattern, and it was tightening. He began flying with fewer lights, running stealth approach vectors, relying on instinct more than instruments. Sometimes he'd go days without speaking, even to his astromech. The silence felt familiar, like Yavin, like Shara, the kind of quiet that knew something was coming. One mission took him near the Varn system. Unregistered moon, faint distress beacon, no visible threat. But as he descended, something felt wrong. The sky was too still, the scanners too clean. He hovered near a ridge, waited, and then saw it. A ship emerging from behind the horizon. Black hull, smooth wings, engine hummed so low it barely registered. It didn't attack. It didn't signal. It just watched. Poe pulled back, rising into atmosphere, not with fear, but with confirmation. Something was there, something organized, something ready. He marked the sighting, didn't report it through open channels. Only to Leia. Later, she told him others had seen it too, but none had returned with coordinates. Poe had. His map kept growing, lines connecting places the galaxy had chosen to forget. And as he traced them, one thought stayed with him. The First Order wasn't building power. It already had it. It was waiting for the rest of the galaxy to realize they were already too late. They weren't just a squad. They were the edge of the blade. Black Squadron wasn't official, not at first. Poe didn't ask permission to form it. He found pilots the way Leia had found him. People with instincts that couldn't be trained, and loyalty that didn't need medals. Each of them had something missing, a friend they couldn't save, a truth they weren't allowed to say, a part of themselves the galaxy no longer needed, until now. Snap Wexley joined first, then Jessica Parva, then Care Kuhn and Lulo Lampar. They weren't perfect, but Poe didn't need perfect. He needed people who would follow him into places they wouldn't be allowed to speak about afterward. Places that didn't officially exist. Places where the First Order was already planting its flags in the dark. Their missions were quick, sharp, unseen. Data recovery from broken satellites. Intercepts of disguised First Order cargo. Extraction of informants who couldn't even say what they knew. And more often, missions that ended with fire. One operation took them to Daxam IV, a moon no one claimed. Intel said it was being used to test communication jammers. Poe's team went in silent. Found not jammers, but a garrison. Stormtroopers in new armor. Cold white, clean lines. They weren't patrolling, they were practicing. Black Squadron took out the command post, erased the data logs, and left before reinforcements arrived. But Lulo was hit. His stabilizer cracked. Poe stayed with him the entire escape, refused to jump to hyperspace until he saw his fighter clear the gravity well. That night, Lulo didn't speak, but Poe saw something change in his eyes. They all felt it. They weren't scouting anymore. They were fighting. The First Order wasn't a rumor. It was here, and every mission drew blood, sometimes theirs. On the outskirts of Mirren Prime, Snap lost a stabilizer and crash-landed near a riverbed. Poe disobeyed retreat protocol to drag him out. They left with one less wing and one more scar. After that, the squad flew closer, spoke less, laughed harder, but only after they landed. Every briefing ended with the same words: check your silence, because every survivor was a target, and the First Order was listening. Poe watched his pilots change, watched them lose weight, lose sleep, not from fear, from understanding. They were dying in a war that hadn't started yet, and no one in the Senate knew their names. No one sent reinforcements. Only Leia did. One encrypted message. One sentence. We see you. Keep flying. That was enough. Until the day it wasn't. Care Kun didn't return from a hyperspace microjump. A routine probe mission. Poe traced her trajectory. Found debris. Not enough to confirm death. Not enough to save hope. He added her to the map. Not as a location, as a silence. Jessica began writing logs she never sent, just in case. Snap started checking the ship twice before sleeping. Even on base. Lulo joked less, smiled only when Poe needed it. They stayed because they believed, not in survival, but in each other. Poe stopped calling it a squad. He started calling it family. And as the First Order crept closer, and their missions grew bloodier, he realized something he never told them. He would fly alone, if it meant they lived. But they never let him, because they were Black Squadron, and they bled first, so the galaxy could have time to wake up. They didn't just fight him, they studied him. At first, Poe Dameron was just a name in resistance reports. A pilot who moved too fast, a commander who struck too early. But as the missions mounted, something shifted. The First Order stopped treating him like a nuisance. They began tracking him like a threat. He noticed it in the way their fighters moved, more coordinated, less reactive, as if they knew what he'd do before he did it. On a run near the Eriadu perimeter, a First Order wing broke formation mid-pursuit. A tactic Poe himself had used months before. He pulled a reverse drift escape and barely made it out. Back at base, he reviewed the telemetry. They weren't just adapting, they were learning him. One of Leia's contacts confirmed it. Intelligence from a captured officer. The First Order had started compiling files on resistance operatives, and Poe's was one of the longest. They called him the Spark, not as praise, as warning. He was destabilizing, predictably, a pilot whose decisions could not be simulated because they weren't built from systems. They were built from instinct. Poe didn't change his style. He sharpened it. But he knew now every success left a trail. Every life he saved created a pattern. And somewhere in the darkness, someone was following that pattern. Whispers began to circulate among First Order command. There was a pilot the Resistance trusted more than anyone. A leader who didn't need orders to strike. A flyer who'd slipped past traps, destroyed outposts, escaped from 4-1 odds. And on the finalizer, a masked figure took interest. Kylo Ren didn't speak Poe's name at first, but he asked for the reports. studied the flight paths, watched the recordings. He saw more than tactics. He saw intention, and he didn't like it because Poe didn't use fear. He used hope. And hope to the First Order was more dangerous than any weapon. When Poe flew over Sinter Glacier Base, he felt it. A presence. Cold. Searching. Not sensors. Not ships. Something else. It didn't stop him. But it left something behind. A question he hadn't asked himself before. What happens when the enemy isn't trying to kill you? What if they're trying to know you? Poe told Leia what he felt. She nodded. Then you're doing something right, she said. Still, the resistance adjusted. Routes changed weekly. Comms encryption doubled. Pilots flew in pairs, then trios. But Poe knew the eyes hadn't stopped following. One mission above Jakku confirmed it. As he dropped into atmosphere, a First Order cruiser emerged. Too quickly, too precisely. They didn't fire immediately. They waited. For what? Poe didn't stay to find out. But as he escaped, he saw it. A flash of black in the viewport, a shuttle departing, and a signature colder than the void. Ren had arrived, not to destroy the base, to intercept Poe. The hunt had begun. He wasn't just a pilot now. He was a symbol. And symbols, once seen, had to be broken. But Poe wasn't hiding. He flew faster, dove deeper, and every time he lit up the dark, he knew the mask was watching, waiting, not to stop the spark, but to smother it. The village slept under fading suns. Stone homes pressed into the dust. Wind moved through hanging cloth like slow breath. Nothing here looked important. That was why Poe Dameron had come. He landed outside the settlement, engines low, systems dark. This was not a place for announcements. It was a place for listening. Lor San Tekka waited near the center of the village. Old, bent, wrapped in simple robes that had seen more years than most starships. He did not greet Poe with urgency. He did not greet him with fear. He greeted him like an ending. You took a risk coming here, the old man said. Poe nodded once. I always do. They walked together through narrow paths carved by time. Poe noticed the way villagers watched from doorways, silent, cautious. They knew what the First Order did to places like this. They knew survival meant being forgotten. Lor San Tekka stopped beside a low stone marker. He knelt with effort. From inside his robes, he removed a small device. Old, scarred, protected more by faith than metal. The map is incomplete, he said quietly. But it is enough. Poe didn't reach for it. He listened. The last Jedi did not vanish by accident. Lor San Tekka continued. He left because the galaxy was not ready. But one day it would be. Poe thought of Leia, of the weight she carried, of a war no one wanted to name yet. Why me? Poe asked. Lor San Tekka looked at him with tired eyes. Because you will not try to be more than you are, he said. And because you will not stop moving. The device passed into Poe's hands. It felt heavier than it should have. Not with mass, with consequence. Before Poe could speak again, the sound came. Engines. Sharp. Clean. Wrong. Poe turned toward the sky. Ships tore through the clouds, dark against the light. Troops poured into the village with practice speed. No warnings, no demands, just arrival. Kylo Ren stepped from his shuttle, like a shadow given shape. The village froze. Poe moved. Blast of fire cracked the air. Poe returned shots, backing toward the falcon-shaped transport he had chartered. Villagers scattered. Lor San Tekka stood still. Run, Poe said. Lor San Tekka didn't. Ren raised his blade. Red light spilled across stone. You're too late, Lawsan Tekka said calmly. The map is already with him. Poe didn't see the end. He felt it. Something broke behind him as troopers closed in. Poe fired until his power cell screamed empty. A stun blast caught him in the side. His vision burned white. He hit the ground hard. Hands dragged him upright. Bindings snapped around his wrists. The map was torn from his jacket. Ren stood close now. "Where is the rest?" Ren asked. Poe smiled through blood. "If you're asking," he said, "you already lost." The village burned as Poe was taken away. Smoke rose into the sky, a signal no one would answer in time. As the shuttle lifted, Poe felt the weight of the fragment still pressing against his thoughts. The mission had changed. It always did. And somewhere beyond the stars, Leia was waiting for something she did not yet know had been set in motion. Poe closed his eyes as hyperspace swallowed the shuttle. He memorized the feel of the village, the dust, the silence, the old man's certainty. If he survived, he would carry it with him. If he didn't, it would still matter, because hope, once given direction, did not need permission to travel. It only needed someone willing to deliver it, even if the delivery cost everything he had left to give. Poe kept breathing. The mission was not finished. Darkness didn't rush him. It closed around him. Poe Dameron woke to cold metal and restraint. His arms were bound. His head throbbed. The air felt thin, sterile, stripped of warmth. This wasn't a cell meant to hold prisoners. It was a place meant to empty them. The finalizer loomed around him, vast and silent. Its corridors hummed with power, not life. Stormtroopers watched without expression, helmets reflecting Poe's face back at him in fragments. He was dragged forward, not hurried, not delayed, as if his fate was already decided. They brought him into a chamber, lit by harsh, white light. Poe was forced into a chair that locked around his spine and neck. He tested the restraints once. They didn't move. Then the doors parted. Kylo Ren entered without sound. The mask came first. Black, featureless, watching. Poe felt something press against his thoughts before a word was spoken. Not pain, pressure. Ren circled him slowly. "You have something I want," Ren said. Poe breathed in, steady. He didn't look away. "So does everyone else," he replied. Ren tilted his head. The air shifted. The Force entered Poe's mind like a blade searching for seams. Memories surfaced without permission. Yavin, his mother's hands, Leia's voice, the resistance, the village. Poe clenched his jaw. Ren pushed harder. "Where is the map?" Pain flared. Not physical. Deeper. Like something being peeled open. Poe gasped but did not scream. He focused on motion, on flying, on the feeling of stars stretching into lines. Ren faltered, just for a moment. Poe felt it. "You're afraid," Poe said through clenched teeth. "You don't know where he is." "The girl," Ren said suddenly. "She will find it." Poe didn't know who he meant, but he held on to the name anyway. Ren stepped back. The pressure eased, but the silence that followed was worse. Poe's thoughts felt scattered, like debris after an explosion. He struggled to pull them together. Ren studied him. "You resist without training," he said. "You rely on instinct." Poe swallowed. "It's worked so far." "Take him to interrogation," he ordered. The chair unlocked. Poe collapsed forward, caught by troopers before he hit the floor. As they dragged him away, he caught one last glimpse of Ren standing alone in the light. Still watching. The interrogation room was darker. Tools lined the walls. Not for torture, for extraction. Poe was strapped down again. Machines whirred to life. Questions came. Names, coordinates, frequencies. Poe answered none. Shock rippled through him, sharp and precise. He bit down hard enough to taste blood. He focused on one thought. Don't give them Leia. The machine pulsed again. He lost track of time. When it ended, Poe hung limp in the restraints. His vision blurred. His body ached in places he couldn't name. But his mind was still his. Barely. The door opened. A stormtrooper entered. He moved differently, slower, uncertain. He paused when their eyes met. Poe didn't speak. Neither did the trooper. But something passed between them. Not loyalty, not rebellion. Recognition. The trooper turned away quickly, as if afraid of what that moment meant. Poe closed his eyes. He didn't know how long he had. But he knew one thing. The First Order hadn't broken him. And as long as he could still think, still breathe, still wait for the smallest opening, the mission was alive. The stormtrooper returned. Not with orders, not with weapons, with keys. He paused outside the interrogation chamber, looked both ways, then stepped inside, locking the door behind him. Poe raised his head, one eye swollen, lips cracked. Your FN 2187, Poe rasped. The trooper froze, then nodded. Poe saw it then, the smallest crack in the armor, not in the plating, in the posture, in the silence. The kind of silence that came from someone realizing they couldn't keep doing what they were told. The trooper approached fast. He didn't explain. He acted. The restraints released. Poe collapsed forward. The trooper caught him, one hand steady beneath his arm. There was no plan, only motion. They moved through the halls like shadows. No one questioned the sight of a trooper escorting a prisoner. That was the danger of a uniform. It made anything look routine. They reached the hangar. Rows of TIE fighters sat in clean formation, each one ready, cold. Poe scanned the lineup, pointed with a weak hand. That one. The trooper nodded. He entered the launch codes. Alarms didn't sound. No questions were asked. Poe climbed into the gunner seat, still aching every breath a reminder he wasn't done yet. What's your name? Poe asked. The trooper paused. I don't have one. Poe frowned. You're going to need one. The ship powered up. Stormtroopers turned. Too late. The engines flared. They launched. Fire trailed behind them. It wasn't a clean escape. TIEs followed. Turrets locked on. The starboard wing took a glancing hit, but Poe had already spun the ship sideways, evading into open space. The trooper, now pilot, gripped the controls with shaking hands. You ever flown one of these? Poe asked. No. Poe smiled. Keep doing exactly that. They broke orbit, jumped. The stars stretched into streaks, then vanished. For the first time in days, Poe breathed. The trooper turned in his seat. I couldn't do it, he said. They told me to fire on civilians. I didn't. I ran. Poe studied him. What you did, that wasn't running. I need a name, he said quietly. Poe looked around. Your FN 2187, right? He nodded. Okay. Finn. That's what we'll call you. Finn. The name settled like light through a crack. Finn nodded once, then the ship jolted. A systems warning blared. Smoke, heat, control flicker. Poe didn't panic. Get us lower, he shouted. Anywhere. Finn angled toward the closest planet, Jakku. The ship spiraled, broke atmosphere. Flames licked the hull. The impact was near instant. Poe never saw the ground, only fire, only Finn, bracing beside him. Then nothing. He woke half buried, Alone. No wreckage. No fin. Just heat. Sand. Silence. He crawled free, body screaming. The ship had split. He couldn't see the cockpit. Couldn't see escape marks. But the jacket was still there. Burned. Empty. Poe took it and kept moving. Not to escape. To finish. The map still mattered. Leia still waited. And the First Order would keep hunting. Poe didn't mourn the escape. He built on it. Because the name Finn lived now. And names, like missions, didn't end when things went wrong. They just needed someone to carry them forward. The galaxy thought he was gone. Scans showed wreckage in the sand. No trace of movement. No pulse from the tie. Resistance reports marked him missing. The First Order marked him dead. Leia didn't. She paused when she read the message, then set it down, unread by anyone else. The map was gone, Poe was gone, and the sky grew quieter. But she didn't grieve. Not yet, because people like Poe didn't vanish. They returned when the story demanded it. Jakku burned beneath a twin sun. Poe moved through the wreckage, with dust in his lungs and blood in his mouth. He left footprints where the wind erased everything else. No gear, no backup, no direction. But he wasn't lost. He followed instinct, the same force that had kept him alive through every storm. He listened for engines, looked for smoke, hunted for the thread that would lead him off-world. He didn't find Finn, but he found signs, blaster marks, drag trails. A crashed freighter burned to its frame. No survivors, but no bodies either. Someone had lived. That was enough. Poe bartered for a ride with a scavenger who wanted too much. He gave a piece of his ship, a piece of himself. The man flew him off Jakku at dawn. No one stopped them. Poe didn't head for a base. He headed for the Resistance outpost on Dequar. The pilot at the gate almost fired, until he saw the eyes, worn, focused, familiar. They let him through without questions. Leia was waiting. She didn't hug him. She nodded once. "You always come back," she said. He didn't answer. There was too much to do. The map had been in BB-8. Poe didn't know if the droid had made it. But Leia had already received word. The droid was with Rey, and Rey had found Finn. Poe smiled, then let it fade, because there was still a hole in the map. The coordinates Lawsan Tekka had given him were only part of the puzzle. The rest had been hidden for years, locked inside the R2 unit that hadn't moved since Luke vanished, until now. R2 was awake. The pieces came together, and the star chart shimmered with a destination. R-Hark-2, the place Luke Skywalker had chosen to disappear. The mission had never been about survival. It had been about return, about delivering a path to the one person who could still make the galaxy believe again. And Poe had done it. Not because he was the best pilot, but because he never stopped moving forward, even when the sky burned, even when hope cracked, even when the Resistance was ready to write his name into history and call it an ending. He didn't die on Jakku. He didn't disappear in the wreck. He didn't wait for someone to come find him. He walked through fire. He rebuilt the trail. And when he stepped back into the Resistance command center, the galaxy shifted. Because now there was a direction, a name, and a reason to keep going. Poe Dameron didn't chase legends. He delivered them, piece by piece, planet by planet, even when the stars tried to forget him. It was colder than it should have been. The readings came in slowly, planet-sized mass, hollowed out, reactor signatures stronger than anything the Resistance had seen since the Death Star. Stronger, wider, deeper. But this wasn't just a super weapon. This was a grave. Poe Dameron stood beside Leia as the first full schematics came through. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. She saw it in his eyes. Recognition. Not of the machine, but of what it meant. Starkiller Base was built in silence. A weapon hidden beneath the snow, buried in myth, fed by stolen stars. It could reach across the galaxy. One shot. One system. Gone. Hosnian Prime was the first. The New Republic's capital. Poe watched from the command room as the light shattered, as the sky above turned red, as the heartbeat of the Senate died mid-sentence. No declaration, no warning, just erasure. The Resistance didn't wait for another attack. They couldn't. Leia gave the order with the quiet strength of someone who'd seen planets fall before. "We strike now," she said. She turned to Poe. "You lead." There were no second options. Black Squadron was briefed in shadow. The plan was direct and suicidal. Find a weakness, get in, blow the oscillator, escape if possible. Poe didn't argue. He knew the odds. Every pilot did. But he also knew something deeper. If they didn't fly now, nothing else would matter. Not Dakar. Not the Resistance. Not even Luke. Because the stars themselves would start going out, one by one. The launch was silent. No speeches. Just nods. The hangar opened. Engines flared. And Poe Dameron, call sign Black Leader, led the squadron into the dark. The stars around Starkiller were cold. Wrong. Like they had been drained of meaning. Poe saw the planet's surface ahead, smooth and endless, like a frozen breath waiting to exhale. He checked his systems, checked his team. No one backed out. They dove, through clouds of ion-charged snow, through flak fire screaming from the mountain ridges, through silence that didn't belong to space, but to death. The oscillator was massive, a dark wound across the planet. The target was small, a narrow exhaust port, reinforced, protected. It would take multiple runs. It would take sacrifice. Poe called the first approach. Snap Wexley to his left, Jessica behind, Lulo at the far wing. "Eyes forward," he said. "Let's burn it down." The First Order rose to meet them, ties in new paint. Faster, sharper. Their movement mirrored training drills Poe had run years ago. Except these pilots didn't hesitate. They didn't warn. They killed. Black Squadron split. Dogfights tore across the sky. Poe didn't flinch. He moved like instinct, like prophecy. Every barrel roll, every shot, every dive into cloud cover, timed to memory. But memory couldn't protect everyone. Snap's wing was clipped. He spun, smoke trailing, vanished behind the ridge. Poe called his name once. No answer. He didn't call again. He couldn't. They reached the oscillator. First run failed. Second run hit the shield. No damage. Third run, shields flickering. Timing tighter. And Poe knew. They had one shot left. He turned back toward the trench, let the X-Wing drop low, and whispered a name. Shara. For focus. Because she had taught him what it meant to fly when death was already waiting. And now, all he had to do was remember. The sky above Starkiller was full of fire. Black Squadron dove into it without hesitation. The trench was narrow. The guns, precise. Every second demanded decisions that couldn't be taught. Every move risked everything they had left. Poe didn't call it bravery. He called it responsibility. Jessica peeled left. Lulo climbed high, drawing 2 ties away. Poe dropped low, letting his ship skate the surface of the oscillator trench. Ice cracked beneath his thrusters. Flak boomed overhead. He was counting. Not seconds, Names. Who was still with him? Who had stopped answering? Behind him, one X-wing spiraled out, trailing smoke. He didn't look back. Couldn't. Ahead, the trench narrowed further. The oscillator was vulnerable, but shielded from angles that made sense. They would have to thread the impossible. Poe's targeting systems flashed red. He silenced them. He didn't need a computer to fly this. He needed memory. The first shot missed. The second hit plating. Then a voice crackled through. Lulo. Now or never. Poe dove again. Lower. The walls of the trench blurred. His stabilizers screamed. He lined up the shot, not with his eyes, but with his breath. He remembered his mother's voice, the way she used to hum before every launch. He heard it now, soft, unshaken. He fired and pulled up hard. The torpedoes vanished into the darkness. Then light. A pressure wave slammed his ship upward. His screens went blind. Sparks flew from the console. The X-wing buckled but held. The oscillator ruptured. The sky turned gold. Below, the snow cracked, steam roaring through fractured terrain. The mountain began to tear itself apart. The First Order scrambled. Too late. Black Squadron was scattered, but alive. Poe checked for signals. Only a few answered. Jessica, injured but flying. Lulo, gone silent. The rest, he didn't ask. He turned toward open space. Fire rained behind him. The resistance base had already evacuated. The fleet was waiting, but no one said anything yet. The shot had landed. The impossible had been done. But Poe didn't feel triumphed. He felt weight, because that trench hadn't just been a path to victory. It had been a tomb, a place where names stopped echoing, and where even success felt like loss. The oscillator burned from within. Starkiller Base screamed beneath the snow, the tremor echoing through mountain and trench. The shot Poe fired had cracked more than a reactor. It had torn through the heart of a weapon built to unmake worlds. He didn't look back. There was no time. His X-wing was dying. Smoke bled from a ruptured vent. Controls lagged. The right wing dragged slightly, like the air itself resisted his survival. Warning lights blinked across the cockpit. Red, yellow, then red again. Poe adjusted the throttle manually. The ship shuddered, but obeyed. Ahead, the path to space narrowed. Behind him, it collapsed. Every choice in that moment had to be perfect. The core of the base erupted in stages. Plasma streaks lit the sky. Snow melted into steam. Poe flew through it, not away from danger, but straight into the corridor that was breaking apart with each passing second. The trench run had been clean compared to this. This was flying through fire, flying through collapse, flying without a map. He caught a glimpse of another X-wing rising. Jessica. Her voice came through the comms, distorted. Black Leader, are you clear? He didn't answer right away. He was pushing the ship too hard to speak. He could feel it, every metal panel resisting, every engine pulse begging to shut down. But he held the yoke tighter, jaw clenched, eyes fixed forward. Then he saw it. A break in the clouds, a line of stars through a seam in the atmosphere. He pushed the throttle, not for speed, for survival. The X-wing roared. Behind him, the reactor detonated in full. The shockwave was enormous. His ship surged upward, thrown more than flown. He let it ride the blast, adjusted pitch, caught the tail end of the momentum, and pulled back as hard as the frame would allow. For a second, the screens went dark, and then sky, open sky, starlight. He burst through the clouds, gasping as if he hadn't taken a breath in hours. The oxygen recycler hissed weakly. still operational. He heard Jessica's voice again. Closer this time. You made it, she whispered. Poe didn't answer. He was staring back down at the planet's surface. A chasm had opened across the ice. A black, burning wound. The remains of Starkiller Base split like a broken tomb. Fires dotted the ridges. Smoke reached into the sky like a hand trying to hold on. But it couldn't. The base was falling apart. The First Order had built a monument to fear. Now it was crumbling into memory. He saw no enemy ships. No more fighters. Just silence. A victory without noise. He keyed the nav system. Leia's coordinates were already waiting. He locked course, gave one last look to the battlefield below, and pulled into hyperspace. He didn't speak until the stars returned. Didn't move. His hands shook, not from fear, from cost. Because he'd made the shot. He had done the impossible. But the silence in his squad comm told him what it had taken. Lulo, missing. Snap, gone. Others. Names not yet confirmed. He would learn them one by one. He would carry them. Because the price of hope was always higher than the galaxy remembered. And the pilot who made it back first was always the one who had to name the dead. The Resistance called it a victory. The galaxy echoed it louder. The weapon was destroyed. The First Order had been struck. The stars, for a moment, felt safe again. But Poe Dameron didn't feel it. He stood in the hangar bay long after his X-wing was pulled in. The hull smoked. The wings sagged. Technicians rushed around him, calling damage reports. But he didn't move. His helmet sat in his hands, blackened, cracked near the visor. He ran his thumb across the scar in the plating. It hadn't protected him from the heat, only from being seen. Jessica approached slowly. Her arm was bandaged, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. She gave him a tired nod, then sat beside him on the floor. They're gone, she said softly. He didn't ask who. He already knew. Lulo, Snap, Wraith, Call. Too many. They hadn't died in one moment. They died piece by piece, through every run, every mission, every decision that led them to Starkiller. Poe looked at the hangar doors, still closed, still holding back the stars. He had destroyed the base, but he hadn't saved everyone, and for that, the word victory felt hollow. Leia met him later in the command center. She didn't praise him, didn't mention the shot. She just stood beside him, looking at the star map slowly updating in the center of the room. You brought us time, she said. Poe shook his head. I'd buried them. Leia looked at him. You gave them purpose. He didn't reply. He couldn't. Because in his mind, they weren't victories. They were voices. Lulo laughing through static. Snap grumbling before takeoff. The others, their ships, their scars, their silence now. He found himself alone that night, in the hangar again. He stood beneath his X-wing, eyes tracing the burn marks. He remembered his mother's voice, her stories of loss after the Battle of Endor, how some pilots came back to celebration, and others came back to nothing. He had never understood the difference until now. The ones who returned carried the story forward, but they also carried the names. Every time the Resistance added another name to the wall, Poe stood in silence, not for ceremony, not for duty, but because he remembered. He remembered Snap's first sim run, how he joked about the targeting system being too slow. He remembered the way Lulo sat in the mess hall, telling stories older than the war itself. He remembered Wraith, who never missed a shot, until the one that mattered. The galaxy celebrated, but Poe counted. And when he sat in the cockpit again days later, the seat felt heavier, not from fear, from memory. Leia gave him new orders. The First Order hadn't fallen. This wasn't the end. It was the first wound. The resistance needed to rebuild. But Poe didn't wait. He launched before the sun rose. Black leader flying alone now, searching for survivors, for answers, for something that felt like healing. But healing doesn't come quickly, not in war, not in flight. He carried the weight with him. And in every quiet moment between systems, he whispered names into the dark, not because he needed to, because no one else would. Leia always filled the bridge with quiet strength. Her presence didn't demand attention. It earned it. People leaned in when she spoke. And when she didn't, her silence still guided them. But now, she was gone. Her body still breathed, barely. But her voice, her eyes, her will, they were absent. And in that absence, everything changed. Poe stood still for the first time in hours. The Resistance cruiser creaked beneath his boots, listing through a shrinking patch of stars. The last fuel was being rationed. Friends he'd flown with for years had died minutes ago. Dozens more were running out of time. And standing across from him was someone he didn't trust. Vice Admiral Holdo. She didn't speak like Leia. She didn't move like her. Her gaze drifted past him, as if he were just another officer. Not the one who'd led the assault on Starkiller. Not the one who'd lost Black Squadron. Not the one Leia had trained, chosen, believed in. Poe hated it. He hated how she looked at fuel numbers but not faces. He hated how she paced the bridge but whispered her plans. He hated the calm in her voice when he asked for answers, and she gave him none. But more than anything, he hated feeling powerless. Because that feeling, the one tightening in his chest now, reminded him of the crash that killed his mother. Of the years after, when he stared at the stars but couldn't touch them. When Leia finally pulled him into the Resistance, that silence broke. He became something again. A pilot, a leader, a man with purpose. But now, the silence had returned. Different, but familiar. Holdo wasn't cruel. She wasn't reckless, but she was silent. And Poe didn't know how to follow silence. He glanced at the command deck. Officers whispered between consoles. Updates came in short, low bursts. Tracking systems showed the First Order was still following. Perfectly, relentlessly, always just out of reach. They didn't need to jump to light speed. They could just wait, and the Resistance would run dry. Poe had done the math. Everyone had. Fuel for 18 hours, life support for 20. No backup, no allies, no escape. And still, Holdo said nothing. Leia would have told them something. She would have looked them in the eyes, even if the truth was grim. But this woman, this stranger in lavender robes, stood like a monument while the galaxy burned. Poe felt it rising again. That heat behind his ribs. That refusal. He had followed orders before and watched friends die. He had obeyed protocols and seen missions fall apart. But when he had trusted his instincts, he had survived. More than survived, he had saved lives. But here on this bridge, he wasn't sure what was right anymore. Only that doing nothing felt wrong. A quiet voice near the viewport broke the tension. An ensign updated a system check. Something about another ship dropping. More lives gone. Another step closer to extinction. Holdo didn't flinch. Poe stared at her. She didn't even look up. He remembered Leia's last words to him before the blast. There are things you can't solve by jumping in an X-Wing. He hadn't listened then. He wasn't sure he could listen now. But maybe that was the point. Maybe this moment, this silence on the bridge, wasn't a test of action. Maybe it was a test of trust, and Poe wasn't ready to pass it. Action felt better than waiting. Poe Dameron had learned that early. In the cockpit, hesitation killed. You moved, or you burned. You chose, or someone else chose for you. The galaxy didn't reward patience. It rewarded motion. That belief followed him onto the bridge. Every update tightened the clock. Another ship fell behind. Another pilot gone. Fuel bled away in silent numbers that meant death without a single blaster fired. And still, Holdo said nothing. No rally, no explanation, no plan. To Poe, it felt like surrender wearing calm. He tried again, asked for clarity, asked for trust. The answers came back soft and empty. We have a plan. You don't need to know. Focus on your station. Each word pushed him closer to the edge. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of watching everyone else die while someone waited for the perfect moment that would never come. So he stopped waiting. Finn and Rose brought him a chance, a whispered plan, fragile and desperate, a way to disable the tracker, a way to break the pursuit. It wasn't clean. It wasn't certain, but it was something. Something was better than silence. Poe didn't think of it as disobedience. He thought of it as leadership. Leia had trusted him to act. Black Squadron had followed him because he moved first. People didn't need secrets. They needed direction. So he gave it, quietly at first. Conversations in corridors, glances held too long. Officers who felt the same fear, the same pressure, the same sense that time was being wasted. Poe didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He inspired. And inspiration can be dangerous when it isn't grounded in truth. The mutiny happened without a shout. No blasters raised. No alarms. Just a moment where Poe stepped forward and Holdo stepped back. For an instant, he felt relief. He had taken control. He had done something. Orders flowed. Teams moved. The plan unfolded. But the galaxy does not pause for relief. The First Order adapted. The infiltration failed. The tracker remained online. And the resistance paid the price. Not all at once, but in pieces. Ships were destroyed while Poe argued. Lives were lost while plans shifted. The silence he had tried to escape followed him into action, heavier now. Then the truth surfaced. Holdo's plan wasn't nothing. It was evacuation, transport slipping away under cloak, a slow escape, risky, quiet, precise. A plan built on trust, the very thing Poe had broken. When the First Order discovered the transports, the cost was immediate. Lasers cut through fragile hulls. Escape pods became coffins. Screams filled channels Poe couldn't shut off. He had wanted to save everyone. Instead, he had exposed them. The mutiny ended the moment Leia woke. She crossed the bridge, unsteady, eyes tired, and looked at Poe, not with anger, but with disappointment deeper than anger could reach. She stunned him herself. As he fell, he heard her voice. Hope is not a strategy. When he woke later, the ship was quieter. Too quiet. The cost of his choice had settled into the walls, into the air. He replayed every step, every decision, every moment where he had chosen action over understanding. He had thought leadership meant moving first, but now he understood something he had never learned in the cockpit. Sometimes, action is just fear pretending to be courage. And sometimes, the bravest thing a leader can do is wait. Poe woke to quiet. Not the tense quiet of pursuit. Not the charged silence of a bridge waiting for orders. This was different. Heavy, settled. The kind of quiet that came after something irreversible. He sat up slowly. His head ached where Leia had stunned him. But the pain that stayed wasn't physical. It was clarity. The resistance ship drifted, wounded but alive. Outside the viewport, stars slid past without urgency. No alarms, no shouted commands, just movement continuing without him. For the first time in a long while, Poe wasn't at the center of it. He rose and walked the corridors. Faces passed him without accusation, without praise. Engineers worked in silence. Medics moved between stretchers. There was no anger left to give him, only exhaustion. He saw the aftermath of his choices in small details, empty seats in briefing rooms, names removed from flight rosters, helmets stacked neatly, waiting for owners who would never return. He remembered every moment that led here. Every time he'd interrupted Holdo, every time he'd assumed silence meant failure, every time he'd confused motion with leadership. Holdo's plan had never been cowardice. It had been restraint. She had trusted people to do their jobs without needing applause. She had believed that survival sometimes meant disappearing, not striking back. And Poe had nearly destroyed that chance because he couldn't stand not being in control. He found Holdo's quarters empty, no personal effects, no notes, just a terminal, powered down. She had given everything to the plan, including the space for others to doubt her. Later, Poe stood at the viewport as the resistance prepared for another move. The evacuation had cost them dearly, but not completely. Some transports had escaped, some lives had been saved because of Holdo, because of sacrifice. He finally understood the moment he had missed before. Leadership wasn't about being seen. It wasn't about being right first. It wasn't about proving courage. It was about carrying weight quietly, about trusting others when fear demanded control, about knowing when not to speak. Leia found him there. She didn't lecture him. She didn't praise him either. She stood beside him, eyes forward, watching the stars. "You wanted to help," she said. He nodded. "I know," she replied, "but wanting isn't enough." Poe swallowed. "I failed." Leia turned to him. "You learned." The words landed harder than any reprimand could have. She told him about Holdo's final decision, about the hyperspace maneuver, about a woman who had chosen to become a weapon so others could escape, a leader who didn't need to survive to succeed. Poe closed his eyes. He saw Black Squadron again. Starkiller's sky. Names that still echoed in him. He realized something then. Every time he rushed forward, someone else paid the price. Every time he slowed down, others had a chance. Leia placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're not done," she said. "But you are changing." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The lesson had settled deep. Not all defeats come from losing battles. Some come from learning too late. And some come just in time to save what remains. Poe Dameron stepped away from the viewport, with a different weight on his shoulders now. Not guilt, the kind that doesn't shout, the kind that listens. Leia wasn't the same when she woke. Not weaker, just quieter, like something inside her had gone still. Poe stood near her bedside, waiting for permission to speak. She gave it with a glance. No words, just a slow nod that said she remembered everything. The mutiny, the risk, the losses. But she also remembered him before that. The pilot who never left anyone behind. The man who once flew into a planet's core because it was the only way through. She had seen his fire. Now she needed to see his patience. They didn't speak much in those hours. The resistance was still running. Crate was a faint hope, a place with old rebel roots and no guarantees, but it was a direction. And Leia had always believed movement meant survival. This time, she let Poe choose how they moved. He was hesitant, careful. He asked for opinions. He listened to warnings. It didn't feel like leadership. It felt like hesitation. But Leia saw something else. He wasn't lost. He was learning to wait. When they reached Crate, Poe stepped aside. Let others organize. Let soldiers breathe. He saw fear in their eyes and didn't try to erase it. He let it exist. He knew now that fear wasn't failure. It was a sign people still understood what was at stake. Finn wanted to charge. Poe held him back. He looked at the surface, saw the cannon, saw the trap. And for the first time in his life, he told them not to fight, not to win, to fall back. It wasn't easy. Watching others retreat, hearing the silence of giving up the field. But Poe knew the truth now. The resistance wasn't about the fight. It was about the survival of belief. If one spark stayed alive, the fire could return. And that spark was in Rey. He didn't know how or when, but Leia did. And through her eyes, Poe began to understand what hope truly meant. Not blind optimism, not reckless action, but trust in what comes next, even when you're not the one to lead it. When Luke Skywalker appeared on the battlefield, Poe didn't cheer. He didn't shout. He watched. A Jedi, alone, buying time. And Poe knew what was happening. He saw the same thing in Luke that he had seen in Holdo, a leader who didn't need to win, just needed to give others a chance. They escaped through the back caverns. Every second counted. And when the last transports lifted, Poe looked to Leia. She was already moving toward the Falcon. She didn't speak, but her expressions said enough. You kept them alive. You didn't save the resistance. You preserved it. There was a difference, and Poe carried that weight with care. On the Falcon, surrounded by wounded survivors, Poe sat quietly. Finn leaned beside him. Rose slept against the wall. Chewbacca flew. Leia rested. It wasn't victory, but it was something. Poe didn't feel like a hero anymore, not in the way he used to. He felt steady, a part of something larger, something he didn't have to lead alone. Later, as the stars shifted outside the viewport, Poe walked the length of the ship. He paused in the corridor where Rey sat in thought, where droids moved without sound. This was all that remained, and somehow it was enough. Leia found him again, same quiet as before. Only now, Poe understood it. She didn't need to speak. He didn't either. The resistance hadn't lost. It had been reborn. And this time, Poe Dameron would protect it differently. Not by being loud, not by being fast, but by becoming the voice Leia once heard in herself, the one that knew when to act and when to wait. He was never supposed to end up there. Kijimi wasn't a destination, it was a consequence. A cold, lawless moon on the edge of forgotten trade routes. Poe Dameron didn't land there to start a new life. He crashed into it, like someone trying to vanish without making a sound. Back then, he had no rank, no mission, no cause, just silence. And the kind of grief that wraps around you when everyone else believes you're fine. The war against the Empire was over. His parents were gone. The medals meant nothing. Peace had arrived, and it didn't need him. So he left everything behind. The clean ships of the New Republic, the ideals of Yavin, even Leia. He didn't want guidance. He wanted distance, far from people who expected him to lead, far from a galaxy that kept naming heroes and burying them before they were ready. Kijimi offered none of that. It offered shadows and anonymity and danger, and he accepted all of it. He joined the Spice Runners, not because he believed in their cause, but because they didn't ask questions. They didn't care who he had been. They only cared that he could fly, that he could shoot, and that he didn't flinch when things went dark. In that world, no one pretended to be good. That was its own kind of honesty. He wasn't proud of what he did. He didn't hate it either. He treated each job like a test. Another flight, another delivery, another storm to survive. And deep down, he told himself it wouldn't last, that one day he'd find his way back to something better. But the days blurred, the missions stacked, and his name, Poe Dameron, started to mean less, until someone reminded him who he really was. Zori Bliss didn't let people in. She was colder than the streets of Kijimi, sharper than the knives she carried, and faster to shoot than to speak. But she saw through him. She knew he wasn't like the others, not because he was better, but because he was running. And for a time, she made him stop. They never called it love. That word didn't exist in the places they worked. But it was trust. It was knowing someone had your back when the sky fell. It was rare, dangerous, and more fragile than either of them wanted to admit. Poe thought it might save him, thought she might be the reason he stayed, but that was the lie. He was never going to stay. He left without warning, no message, no final run, just silence, again. It was easier than explaining the truth, that every part of Kijimi was a reminder of the man he didn't want to become, that if he stayed, he'd forget who he used to be. And that Zori deserved someone who wasn't always looking to disappear. So he vanished, back into the stars, back toward Leia, and eventually into the Resistance. But he carried it with him, every flight, every kill, every quiet moment between missions. The face of the girl behind the helmet, the streets covered in frost, the breathless tension of life on the edge. He told himself he had moved on, that Kijimi was the past, a mistake. Then, one day, his ship landed there again, not by choice, by necessity. And everything he'd buried started rising again, faster than he could shut it down, because Kijimi had changed. And so had Zori Bliss. She was still wearing the helmet. That was the first thing Poe noticed, as if no time had passed, as if he had walked out yesterday. But time had passed. Years of silence, years of war, years of her wondering why the only person she ever trusted had disappeared without a word. Zori Bliss didn't greet him. She didn't aim a blaster either. Her voice didn't shake and her tone didn't rise. She just stood there, a fixed silhouette in a city that no longer cared about memory. She'd become colder, quieter, like the flame that used to burn behind her eyes had learned to live in the shadows. He spoke first. He had to, but the words felt smaller than they should have. Apologies didn't fit. Excuses were worse. She didn't want explanations. She wanted the truth he'd never said out loud. And he wasn't sure he had the strength to give it. She asked him why he left, and this time, he didn't lie. He told her everything, not with defense, not with guilt, just with the weight of someone who had finally stopped running. He had been afraid of peace, of stillness, of her, because she made him feel like he belonged, and that scared him more than war ever had. Zori didn't flinch. She didn't soften. She listened. And when he was done, she said nothing. Sometimes silence is the only answer you get. But even in her silence, there was a shift. Not forgiveness. That was too much to ask. But recognition. She understood him now, not as the man he became with the Resistance, but as the boy who ran before he knew what he was losing. She didn't need his redemption. She didn't even need his regret. She just needed to know he remembered. That Kijimi wasn't a ghost town in his mind. That she wasn't just another mistake he'd buried under missions and medals. And he did remember. Every alley, every drop-off, every freezing night spent dreaming of somewhere warmer. Every fight they had. Every moment they stood side by side with blasters drawn and breath held. Kajimi hadn't been home, but she had been the closest thing to one. Zori never stopped surviving. She adapted, rose higher, ran her own crew, became what she had to become. In a place like this, that was the only option. Trust was currency, and Poe had spent it all long ago. But she still gave him the coin, the captain's medallion, a pass through any First Order blockade, one of the most valuable things in the criminal underworld. She handed it to him without ceremony, as if it meant nothing, as if she wasn't risking everything just by giving it away. He asked her why. She didn't answer, not with words, just a glance, the kind that said, "You don't get to ask any more." And yet, she had given it, not for the resistance, not for the mission, but because, somewhere deep down, some part of her still remembered the boy who tried to change. Even if he failed, the helmet never came off. She kept the mask on, like always, because feelings weren't safe in places like this, and because maybe showing her face meant letting go of what was left. Poe never asked her to remove it. He didn't need to see her eyes to know what they felt. He could feel it in the silence between them. She didn't forgive him, but she didn't send him away. And sometimes that was enough. It wasn't a warning. There was no time to evacuate, no fleet in orbit, no voice on the comms giving final orders. Just silence, then fire. Poe didn't see the first blast. He felt it, a tremor in the stone beneath his boots, a sudden shift in the wind that wasn't natural. Then the sky turned red, and the horizon cracked open. He'd seen planets die before. Scareft, Hosnian Prime. Starkiller's rage made horror feel distant, like something happening to someone else. But this was personal. This was Kajimi, a place he once hated, a place he once escaped, but still a place that had held pieces of him. People who once knew his name, smells he'd almost forgotten, streets he remembered by instinct. It was being destroyed, and he could do nothing but watch. The final order didn't need reasons. Kajimi wasn't a military target. It wasn't a resistance hub. It was punishment, a warning to those who might care. And in that cold calculation, the First Order made its choice. Burn the past. Poe stood with Zori on a rooftop as smoke swallowed the spires. She didn't say a word. Her crew was gone, her city crumbling. And still, no panic, no screams, just slow breaths and clenched fists, because she had already lost this place once before, when he walked away. Now it was happening again, only this time there was no one left to blame. He wanted to say something, anything. But what do you say when the planet that made you who you are turns to ash in front of you? There was no heroism here, no mission, no victory, just fire. Zori didn't cry, she didn't break, but Poe saw her shoulders fall, just slightly, as if the weight of it all had finally settled. And in that moment, he realized something that hurt more than he expected. She had stayed. Through every betrayal, every risk, every storm that passed over this frozen world, she stayed. While he had flown away to join another war, she had fought one of her own. And Kajimi had become her battlefield, her home, her cage, her cause. He had left because he wanted freedom. She had stayed because she believed in something greater than escape. When the Star Destroyer pulled away and the firestorms dimmed, the city was gone, not ruined, not damaged, gone. Entire districts swallowed into smoke. Marketplaces where they once laughed over stolen credits reduced to flickering embers. The place where they first kissed, buried under rubble and silence. Kajimi didn't die screaming. It just vanished. Poe stared into the destruction and felt hollow. This wasn't justice. This wasn't war. It was erasure. and somehow that felt worse. Zori finally turned to him, and for the first time her voice cracked. Not loud, not angry, just tired. "This is why we fight," she said. "Not for flags, not for orders, for places like this, so they don't disappear." He nodded, not because he agreed, but because he finally understood. It had taken him years, a galaxy's worth of distance. But now he saw what she had seen all along. Survival means nothing if the soul of a place dies, if its memory turns to dust. Kijimi would not be rebuilt. The stars would forget it. Historians would log it as a footnote in a bigger war. But Poe would remember, not because he loved it, but because he owed it everything. They didn't ask him to say sorry. No. One told Poe to apologize. Not to the resistance, not to Zori, not to the dead. And maybe that was the hardest part, because silence left him alone with the truth. The choices he made when no one was watching still mattered. He wasn't the same man who had run spice on Kijimi. He wasn't the hotshot pilot who thought explosions solved everything. But that didn't erase who he'd been, or what that life had taken from others. There were no clean lines anymore. No moments where good and evil stood on opposite sides of the field. The war had blurred them. And in those grey spaces, he saw himself, fractured, uneven, trying to be more than his mistakes. But redemption wasn't a badge you could wear. It wasn't something the galaxy handed back when it was done being angry. Redemption had to be lived, carried, quietly. He asked Zori once before they parted ways again if she believed in second chances. She laughed, not kindly, not cruelly, just real. "No one gives them," she said. "You take them and hope you're not too late." The resistance had no room for the past anymore. There were fewer ships, fewer voices. On the comms, after Kijimi, after the betrayal on Crate, every mission felt like a whisper in a storm. But still, he flew. He led because someone had to. But leadership no longer felt like command. It felt like grief management. Every order he gave might send someone to their death. Every plan could be the last. That weight used to thrill him. Now it hollowed him. There were nights when he couldn't sleep, not because of fear, but because of names. Names he didn't remember but had once signed off on. Names that came across reports he never finished reading. People who followed him, died for him, trusted him. He didn't cry for them. That would be too easy, too neat. Instead, he remembered them silently, in the way he checked his squad's ships twice before takeoff, in the way he briefed slower, more patiently, in how he stopped interrupting the mechanics just because he thought he knew better. Small things, invisible things. But maybe that was the point. True change didn't announce itself. It slipped in through silence, through restraint, through the hard decision not to react, even when everything inside screamed to. He thought about Finn a lot, and how the boy who had once fled a battle was now charging into them without hesitation. Finn believed in him, not because Poe was perfect, but because he tried. That mattered. And so did Rey. She carried something heavier than he could ever understand. The Force, the legacy, the burden of everyone who came before. And yet, she never looked at Poe with judgment. She saw the pain, but she didn't flinch from it. Neither did Leia. Even when he failed her, even when he led a mutiny, even when his actions nearly shattered everything, she still believed. Not because he earned it, but because that's what leaders do. They believe in people who aren't ready. They plant seeds in cracked soil. They wait even when the garden burns. Poe knew he would never be the kind of leader Leia was. He didn't have her calm, her vision, her patience. But he had her memory, and maybe that was enough. He stopped trying to be redeemed and started trying to be present, because the truth was simple. You can't undo the fire. You can only keep flying through the smoke and make sure someone else gets to see the stars. He stood alone in the briefing room, staring at the map like it owed him something. The stars hadn't moved. The enemy hadn't changed. But something inside Poe Dameron had. Leia was gone. She left him the rank, the title, the burden, and he carried it, though it didn't feel like leadership. It felt like waiting to fail. The resistance had gathered what little remained. One more stand, one more try. A final gamble against something ancient, something that should not exist. The Sith had returned, not in whispers, not in shadows, but in full, open defiance of death. Exegol, a world hidden beyond the edges of known space, cold, forgotten, but not lifeless. Poe had seen the reports, the whispers from spies, the fragments of Sith legends, the recovered message that chilled the spine of the galaxy. Palpatine's voice. The message wasn't just a threat, it was a memory. And the galaxy did what it always did when faced with a truth too heavy to bear. It turned away. Poe tried to rally them. He tried to speak the way Leia did. Clear, honest, unshakable. He looked into the eyes of senators, warlords, merchants, and soldiers. And one by one they said nothing. Or worse, they said maybe later, maybe someone else, maybe the Sith aren't real, maybe this isn't our fight. But Poe knew the truth. He'd flown through the fire of Starkiller. He'd watched Hosnian Prime die in silence. He'd seen what happened when the galaxy waited too long. He wasn't a Jedi, he wasn't a Skywalker, but Leia had believed in him, and that belief meant more than fear. They didn't have time. The Final Order fleet was days from rising, star destroyers that could erase cities with one shot, crewed by loyalists who didn't need freedom, only control. Exegol was the heart of something that should have died with the Empire, but it lived in silence. It grew in secret. And now it stood open, daring the galaxy to come and stop it. Poe looked at the fleet, what was left of it. X-wings with scorched hulls, Y-wings that coughed to life, battered transports, half-fueled, pilots too young, mechanics too tired. But still they came. Black Squadron, what remained of red and gold, old friends, new recruits. Even the Falcon held together more by will than wires. They weren't enough, and everyone knew it. But Poe didn't wait for enough. He'd never had that luxury. He only had time to act, or to die. He made the call, the last call, to everyone, everywhere. A simple message. We need help. We can't do this alone. If you can hear this, come. It was all he could offer. A signal in the dark. Somewhere behind him, Finn stood quietly. Not as a soldier, but as a friend. They both knew what was coming. They'd known it since Kijimi, since Crate, since Leia closed her eyes and didn't open them again. This wasn't a fight for survival anymore. It was something heavier, a fight for memory. The memory of everything they lost. The memory of everyone who never got a second chance. Poe walked toward his X-wing. BB-8 beeped once, soft and low. The droid knew the odds, but Poe didn't care. He had the map, he had the coordinates, and even if the galaxy stayed silent, he would speak. He would lead, not because he was sure, but because he couldn't do nothing. He climbed into the cockpit, closed the canopy, looked out into the stars, and whispered the same word Leia had once told him: hope. The approach to Exegol was not loud. It was not heroic. It was quiet, almost sacred. Lightning crawled across the sky like veins of an ancient god, flashing against the storm that never ended. Poe watched it from his cockpit, breathing slow, steady. The galaxy didn't answer his call, at least not yet. But that didn't stop the resistance. They dropped from hyperspace into darkness. No sun, no stars, just the black cloud of Exegol's atmosphere swallowing everything. And inside it, death waited. Poe's voice cracked through the comms. One by one, pilots checked in. Fewer than he wanted, fewer than needed. But they were there. The resistance had always been made of the few. Every ship, every soul carried stories, wounds. Some came from war, some from loss, others from guilt. But they came. Zori Bliss, quiet but present. Babu Frick, perched on a console whispering luck in his own way. Finn, not in Poe's rearview this time, but standing on a destroyer inbound with a mission of his own. And Rey, somewhere far below, lost in a battle of her own, not just with the Sith, but with herself. Poe couldn't help her, not with the Force, not with the past, but he could keep the skies open. He could fight so that she had a chance to choose who she was meant to be. That's what Leia had taught him. Leadership wasn't about being the strongest. It was about standing still when others ran and flying forward when others froze. Poe had run before, in the spice lanes of Kijimi, in the orders he broke under Holdo, in the mutiny he still couldn't forget. But not this time. This time he stayed. Exegol opened like a grave. The Sith fleet rose from the surface like teeth. Hundreds of Star Destroyers, each with world-killing power, now awakening to crush hope once and for all. Poe knew the plan wasn't perfect. It wasn't even good. But it was all they had. Disable the navigation tower, blind the fleet, destroy what they could, and survive if possible. The first shots came like whispers, silent flickers of red through the black clouds, then screams, then fire. Pilots vanished mid-sentence. One squad lost, then another. Poe didn't flinch. He called out names, orders, adjustments. He heard Temin scream something hopeful before it cut out. He saw Jessica Parva diving into a hail of fire, wings burning. He felt the sky shrinking. Still, he flew. Each second was earned, each breath a gift. They weren't winning, but they were holding. And then silence broke again. Not on comms, not through words, but in the Force itself. A wave, a pull, a feeling like something ancient had awoken. Something colder than Exegol's sky. Poe didn't have a name for it, but Rey did. And she was somewhere below, facing it alone. He wanted to believe, not just in her, but in all of it, in the idea that something good could rise from this storm. That sacrifice mattered, that ghosts don't get the last word. Then came the moment he feared. The nav tower switched, the final order adapted, and the plan began to fall. Ships were lost faster than orders could be given. Fire lit the clouds like thunder trapped in glass. The resistance was drowning. Poe felt the breath catch in his chest. For the first time, he had no words, no orders, just silence. But before it could crush him, he heard a voice, crackling through the static. Familiar, old, steady. This is Lando Calrissian. You're not alone. And for the first time, Poe believed it. The sky changed when they arrived. At first, Poe thought it was interference. More lightning, more chaos layered onto an already broken horizon. But then the sensors screamed. Signatures flooded the display. Hundreds, thousands, ships emerging from hyperspace like a tide breaking through a dam. Not military formations, not uniform fleets. Everything. Freighters, gunships, fighters patched together with hope and memory. Old Alliance craft, civilian transports. smugglers, pilots who had never worn a uniform and never wanted to. The galaxy had heard him. Poe felt something loosen in his chest. Not relief, not joy, something steadier. Permission. Lando's voice cut through again, calmer than the storm around them. He didn't give orders. He didn't need to. The ships moved with purpose, instinctively forming lines, covering flanks, drawing fire. They weren't trained for this. They were committed. The final order turned its guns outward. Star destroyers pivoted, firing into the mass of arriving ships. Explosions filled the sky. Vessels vanished in fire, without shields, without backup. And still, more came. Poe shouted coordinates, redirecting squadrons, pushing the fight away from the core of the fleet. He wasn't thinking about strategy anymore. He was reacting, trusting what Leia had taught him. Protect the people. Let the fight come to you. He saw Finn's transport break through cloud cover, dropping low across a destroyer's hull. He saw Rose coordinating evacuation routes mid-battle. He saw Zori's ship flash past his canopy, guns blazing, not looking back. This wasn't a victory. It was defiance. The Sith fleet was still immense, still deadly, still rising from the surface like an endless shadow. But now, it wasn't unopposed. Poe banked hard, dodging a barrage that tore through the space he had occupied seconds earlier. He returned fire, not aiming for kills, but for openings. Every second mattered. Every distraction saved lives he would never meet. The nav tower shifted again. Another adjustment, another problem. New target, Poe said, forcing calm into his voice. We take it out or we're done. No cheers followed. No acknowledgement. Just action. Fighters peeled off. Bombers dove. The sky fractured under pressure. Poe felt the cost with every loss. He watched ships disappear without names, without stories. He couldn't mourn them now. He couldn't stop, because below, Rey was still fighting. He felt it again, that pull in the air. Not fear, not pain, hope. Fragile, flickering. But there, the Sith lightning grew stronger. Bolts lashed upward from the surface, tearing through ships like paper. Poe screamed a warning too late. A transport burst apart in blue fire. He clenched his jaw. This was the price. Being right didn't mean being spared. It meant standing long enough for someone else to finish the fight. He remembered Leia's hand on his shoulder. The weight of command. The quiet trust. He wasn't flying for glory. He was buying time. The tower fell. The sky shifted again. The fleet below lost cohesion, drifting, colliding, exposed. Poe saw the opening immediately. All wings, push, he shouted. Now, they surged forward, pouring fire into exposed hulls, into systems no longer aligned. Destroyers fell, one by one, crashing into the storm below. The darkness began to break. Poe didn't cheer. He didn't slow, because this wasn't over. Victory was never clean. It was layered with fire and ghosts and people you couldn't save. And somewhere beneath the clouds, the final choice was being made. He could only hope that everything he had held together long enough would matter. The Sith throne cracked. Poe didn't see it, but he felt it, like a current in the Force, moving through the air. Something old had ended, not with celebration, but silence. The lightning stopped. The sky was darker now, not because of fear, but because the storm had passed. The battle above still raged, but the center had collapsed. The final order, once unshakable, now drifted like broken pieces of a forgotten empire. Ships retreated. Others fell. Some simply stopped firing. Poe kept flying. He couldn't afford hope yet. Not fully. Not until he saw her. Then the message came. Finn's voice, barely audible, breaking through static. She did it. That's all. She did it. Rey was alive. Somehow he didn't understand how or what it cost, but the wave that moved through the fleet was real, like a breath, like the first sunrise after a long night. Poe exhaled and realized he hadn't been breathing. It was over. The resistance began pulling back. Not out of fear, but necessity. They couldn't save every ship. Some wouldn't make it, but enough had survived. Enough to rebuild. Black Leader turned his ship toward the rally point. The stars stretched into view again, not clear, but visible. Back on Arjan Kloss, the silence felt different. No alarms, no orders, just voices, laughter, crying, people hugging too tightly, droids carrying wounded on stretchers built from broken ship panels. Poe didn't say much. He walked slowly through the hangar, nodding at faces he recognized. Some smiled, others didn't. Some looked for names that would never appear again. He understood that part best. Victory wasn't the opposite of loss. Sometimes it was what made loss feel heavier. Zori stood near the edge of the crowd, helmet on, arms crossed. She didn't wave, didn't smile, but she stayed. Poe walked up to her. "Thanks for coming," he said. She shrugged. "Didn't do it for you." But her voice was soft. She turned to leave, then paused. "You owe me a favor." He nodded. "Always." She vanished into the crowd. BB-8 rolled up beside him, scuffed, burnt, but alive. Poe knelt beside the droid, placing a hand on his dome. "We made it," he whispered. BB-8 let out a low chirp, not cheerful, just tired. In the main hall, Lando was surrounded by younger pilots, telling stories, smiling, filling the space Leia once filled. And that's when Poe saw the cloak, folded neatly on a crate near the command post. Leia's rank insignia resting atop it. Nobody touched it. Nobody dared. He approached it slowly, his boots echoing in the quiet. The others stepped aside. He didn't pick it up, just looked at it. Then at the empty chair where she used to sit. The command console dim, the room still. Poe took a breath, then sat down, not to replace her, just to continue what she started. The others followed. Finn, Rose, Connix, Chewie, droids and engineers and medics and smugglers, people from every part of the galaxy. They didn't cheer. They just stood with him. And something settled. The war wasn't over. Darkness would return. Somewhere, somehow. But in this moment, with stars visible again, Poe Dameron became what Leia Organa always believed he could be. Not just a pilot, not just a leader, but a light. A steady, stubborn flame in a galaxy that kept trying to go dark. And this time, he didn't fly away. He stayed. There were still lights on in the resistance base, but no voices. Poe walked through what remained. The walls that once echoed with strategy and laughter were quiet now. Cold air drifted between old war rooms and empty bunks. It wasn't haunted, not in the way stories warned, but it felt like walking through a body that used to breathe. He remembered the first day he'd stepped into this place. Leia had still been standing, still commanding. Her presence filled every hallway, even when she wasn't there. Now, it was memory that lingered. That, and the weight of everything they had survived. They had won the war. The final order was gone. The Sith Eternal, their ships, their legions, shattered over the world they tried to enslave. But it didn't feel like victory. Not to Poe. Not in these corridors. Because the ones who mattered most were missing. Snap Wexley, his oldest friend, lost in the sky above Exegol. Carrie's laughter. Connix's quiet steadiness. The pilots, the techs, the kids who had no training but still stayed to fight. Every room reminded him of someone who didn't make it back. He stood in the old hangar. The Falcon was gone. Chewie had taken it. Finn was away, searching for children strong in the Force. Rey was somewhere no one really knew where. She didn't leave a message. Poe didn't blame her. Sometimes disappearing was the only way to heal. He thought of his mother, Shara Bey. She'd walked through hangars like this once. She was a pilot. A real one. He used to sit on her lap and pretend he was flying. Now he was flying, leading, surviving. And he wondered if she would have been proud, or if she would have told him to stop. There was no council anymore, no generals in formation. Poe had command, but no one demanded anything of him now. That silence was louder than orders ever were. He could leave, he could walk away, and no one would say he failed. But something kept him here. Leia's voice, not in words, not out loud, but in that feeling, the one he used to ignore, the one that said, stay, build, prepare. Not for another war, but for the moment peace needs protection. He paced slowly through the mess hall. Tables still had trays stacked from the last day of retreat. Dried stains of calf on durasteel. Someone's old scarf hung from the back of a chair. Poe didn't touch it, because to touch it would be to remember who it belonged to. And remembering hurt more now than it ever had. The resistance had been a cause, a symbol, a whisper of hope in a galaxy drowning in fear. But symbols didn't rebuild. People did. And so Poe stayed. The others came and went. Engineers, former troopers, refugees who needed a place to sleep. The war had broken them too. But somehow, they looked at Poe like he still had answers. He didn't. He had scars, losses, mistakes. He had nights where he couldn't sleep because Snap's voice still rang in his ears. Because Leia never got to say goodbye. Because his mother died thinking the New Republic would last. But he also had something else. A reason. Not glory. Not revenge. Memory. The kind that builds you back when you think there's nothing left. That was what Leia taught him in the end. That being a general wasn't about strategy. It was about protecting people, even from themselves. It was about standing still when everything else fell apart. He looked out across the landing field. No ships, no banners, just quiet stars above. Poe closed his eyes and let the silence settle. Not because he was lost, but because he finally understood where he was meant to be. They kept sending distress signals. Worlds scarred by war. Colonies abandoned by the First Order. Families left behind by both sides. And Poe Dameron, the general without an army, answered everyone he could. These weren't battles anymore. They were recoveries, repairs, convoys to feed the starving, escorts to protect medicine from raiders. There was no glory, just duty. The kind Leia would have never called heroic, just necessary. Poe flew again, but it felt different now. The sky wasn't freedom. It was memory. Every jump to hyperspace passed through shadows. Every descent reminded him of those who never came home. Black Squadron was gone. Temin, dead. Jessica Parva, last seen deep in the mid-rim. Only Ka Kun still answered his calls, and even she sounded tired. The Resistance hadn't won the galaxy. It had just survived, and survival came with a cost. He touched down on Vados. Again, it was the third time that year. The first time he came, there was still smoke rising from the old city. The second, a makeshift clinic needed parts. This time, it was silence. No one answered the beacon. The landing pad was cracked. Storm damage, old blaster marks across the walls. Poe stepped out and scanned the horizon. No troops, no survivors, just a girl, maybe 7, standing alone in the doorway of a building with no roof. He didn't ask her name. She didn't speak. He just knelt and offered his hand. She didn't take it, but she didn't run either. He remembered what it meant to be alone and not know what safety looked like anymore. Back in the ship, she sat behind him, quiet, watching stars blur past. Poe didn't ask questions. He didn't have answers. All he could do was fly. That was the mission now. Not rebellion, not attack runs. Just flying, showing up, being the one person who still did. Some nights he stared at the old helmet on his bunk, the one he'd worn when he was still Black Leader. It didn't fit right anymore. Not just physically. It belonged to someone else. Someone faster, louder, and more certain. Poe was quieter now. He didn't shout in briefings. He listened. He asked. He let others lead when he saw the strength in them. Maybe that was what Leia meant all along. That true command wasn't noise. It was presence. He dropped supplies on Jakku, then Castel, then Belkadan, names that didn't matter to the galaxy anymore. But they mattered to the people still trying to live there. A boy hugged him on the landing ramp once. Dirty face, torn boots, no words. Just arms wrapped around Poe's chest like he'd come to save everything. Poe didn't save everything. But he stayed long enough to build a water pump before leaving. Some said he was wasting time, that the resistance should focus on rebuilding its strength. Weapons, ships, defense. But Poe had seen what happened when people forgot to care about each other. That's what the First Order was, a machine of forgetting. It erased names, planets, pain, turned everything into numbers and targets. Leia never let that happen, and Poe wouldn't either. So he flew, again and again. The galaxy didn't cheer anymore. There were no grand speeches, no medals, no hollows of victory, but there were people, scared, hungry, still hopeful. And to them, a ship landing meant someone remembered they existed. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was the real war now. Not against enemies, but against silence. And Poe Dameron refused to let the galaxy go quiet. Poe kept a list, not in a datapad, not in any archive. It lived in him, carried through long flights and quiet nights when the stars felt too close. Names etched into memory, heavier than armor. Leia Organa was always first, not because she was the greatest loss, but because she was the center. Everything traced back to her. Every choice Poe made, every risk he took, every time he stayed when it would have been easier to leave. She had seen him before. He believed in himself, had trusted him when he was still learning how to listen. He never said goodbye. The war didn't allow it. It rarely did. Then there was Snap Wexley. Snap had laughed like the war couldn't touch him, had flown like nothing scared him. Poe remembered the sound of his voice over comms, calm even when the sky burned. Remembered promising he'd watch Snap's win. Remembered failing. Some losses felt sharp. Others settled slowly, like frost. Shara Bey was different. His mother had died long before this war, long before Exegol. But her absence had shaped every moment of his life. She taught him how to fly, but more importantly, why. Flying wasn't escape. It was responsibility. You didn't leave the ground just to feel free. You left it to protect what couldn't follow you. Poe wondered what she would think of him now. A general without a government, a pilot who flew mercy runs instead of attack patterns, a man who had survived every war he entered. Survival wasn't something she'd praised. Meaning was. There were others, too many to name aloud. Pilots lost over Starkiller, Mechanics crushed under falling hulls, civilians on Kijimi who never even knew his real name, children on Hosnian Prime who never had time to be afraid. Each name pulled at him, not as guilt, as gravity. The galaxy wanted to move on. It always did. Rebuild trade routes, rewrite borders, rename fleets. But Poe understood something most didn't. Moving on didn't mean forgetting. Forgetting was how it all started again. So he spoke their names when no one else did, quietly before launch, under his breath in hyperspace. In the pauses between words when people asked him how he kept going, he didn't answer them. Because the truth was simple. He carried them. Every choice he made now was shaped by loss. He chose caution because he remembered recklessness. He chose patience because he remembered rushing. He chose presence because he remembered leaving. There were moments he felt the weight press too hard, when the silence in the cockpit felt like judgment, when the stars looked like eyes watching to see if he'd learned anything at all. On those nights he didn't fly, he sat in the ship. Lights off, systems idle, and he remembered. Not the explosions, not the screams, the small things. Snap complaining about rations, Leia's half smile when a plan worked, his mother's hands steady on the controls, guiding his smaller ones. Those memories didn't hurt as much. They reminded him why the names mattered, not because of how they died, but because of how they lived. Poe Dameron didn't believe in destiny the way Jedi did. He believed in choices. And the choice he made over and over was to honor the past without being trapped by it. The weight of their names never left him, but it didn't slow him down anymore. It grounded him. And that, more than anything, was what kept him flying straight. The war was over, but peace didn't follow. Not truly. What came after was quieter, more complicated. People called it recovery, rebuilding. Poe saw it for what it was, another kind of mission, one without maps, without clear enemies, and without the people he once leaned on. He stood beneath the stars often, watching young pilots run drills in battered hangars now used for training. The resistance wasn't gone, but it wasn't what it used to be. It couldn't be. Now it was something different, smaller, scattered, held together not by command, but by memory. Poe taught them not how to fight, but why. He never gave speeches, never recited war stories. The young ones already knew them, knew his name, his records, the impossible flight into the heart of Starkiller, the fleeted Exegol that only answered because he called. They saw a legend. He saw a man still learning how to lead without needing to be followed. So he focused on the quiet lessons, let them feel the weight of a cockpit before they ever ignited the engine. Let them sit in silence, with no mission, no orders, just themselves and the stars. If that silence broke them, they weren't ready, because space was beautiful, but it didn't forgive. He taught them how to survive mistakes, how to listen, how to trust a wingmate when they couldn't trust themselves. Sometimes he looked at them and saw versions of himself, brash, restless, hungry to matter. But other times, he saw the ones who came before him, calm eyes, steady hearts, people who fought because they had to, not because it made them feel important. That gave him hope. Not every fight would be won in space. Some would be fought in the Senate, in the streets, in homes still afraid to speak the truth out loud. He didn't need more soldiers. He needed guardians. People who remembered what was lost and why. Leia had once said, "We're not here to defeat fear. We're here to show people they don't have to live in it." Poe repeated those words often, not to the pilots, to himself, because peace wasn't the absence of war. It was the presence of responsibility, of kindness, of memory. The ones who would come next didn't know the galaxy as it was. They would grow up in its shadow, shaped by its scars. But Poe believed they didn't have to repeat it, not if someone stood in their way. Someone who remembered how close they came to losing everything. Someone who refused to let silence take over again. He didn't know if he was that someone forever, but he was, for now. So he stayed, on the old base, in the old ship, with old ghosts and young hearts, teaching, listening, waiting, not for another war, but for the moment they no longer needed him. That would be the real victory, not a destroyed weapon, not a surrendered fleet, but a generation who knew how to protect without destroying, to lead without demanding, to speak without shouting, to fly without running, and to remember, always, the names of those who lit the path, even when that path was dark, even when peace felt fragile, even when the galaxy forgot. Poe Dameron never did, and because of that, neither would they.